The Ghoul Stars occupy a region of space that exists at the very edge of Imperial authority, positioned in the galactic northeast, beyond where the Emperor's light can reliably guide ships through the warp. This sector lies at the fringe of the Imperium Nihilus, though it predates the Great Rift's formation by millennia in its reputation for isolation and horror. The region extends outward from the last reliable navigation beacons, bleeding into the territories adjacent to the halo stars, where the galaxy's spiral arms thin into scattered stellar clusters and vast tracts of interstellar void. The exact boundaries of the Ghoul Stars remain poorly defined in Imperial cartographic records. This ambiguity stems not from bureaucratic negligence, but from the fundamental difficulty of maintaining accurate charts in a region where stellar phenomena behave in ways that defy standard astronomical models. The Administratum's Divisio Immorales maintains what records exist, though these documents carry warnings that date back to the Great Crusade era. Navigators who have survived passage through the region report that the stars themselves seem wrong. Their light spectrum shifted in ways that suggest impossible gravitational forces or temporal distortions that shouldn't exist according to established physics. The region earned its name from the predominance of dying stellar bodies that populate the area. Unlike the vibrant young stars that characterize the galaxy's more hospitable regions, the Ghoul Stars consist primarily of ancient red giants in their final death throes, white dwarfs that emit only the faintest radiation, and an unusually high concentration of neutron stars. These neutron stars cluster together in configurations that suggest either catastrophic stellar events in the region's distant past or gravitational anomalies that drew them together over millions of years. The radiation these stellar corpses emit creates interference patterns that wreak havoc with auger arrays and Vox systems, making long-range communication between ships or planetary installations nearly impossible. The darkness that pervades the Ghoul Stars goes beyond the mere absence of stellar light. Entire systems exist in perpetual twilight, where the local star's output has dimmed to the point that planets receive less illumination than Terra's moon provides. This darkness carries with it a psychological weight that affects even the most hardened Imperial personnel. Astropaths stationed in the region's few remaining outposts report a constant pressure against their consciousness, a sensation they describe as being watched by something vast and patient. Naval crews who spend extended periods in the Ghoul Stars develop a condition the Adeptus Mechanicus officially designates as void melancholia, characterized by paranoia, night terrors, and an overwhelming conviction that the darkness between the stars harbors active malevolence. The warp routes through the Ghoul Stars present navigational challenges that make standard Imperial transit protocols inadequate. The Astronomican's light, which guides navigators across the vast distances of the Imperium, reaches this far northeastern frontier only as the faintest glimmer, insufficient for reliable warp translation. Ships attempting to navigate through the region must rely on ancient charts that predate the Horus Heresy, many of which contain warnings in high Gothic dialects no longer commonly used. These routes twist through the immaterium in patterns that suggest they were deliberately carved rather than naturally occurring, though no records exist of who might have created them or when. The immaterium itself behaves strangely in proximity to the Ghoul Stars. Gellar field malfunctions occur with disturbing frequency, and even when the fields hold, crews report seeing things moving in the warp that don't match any recorded demon manifestation. These entities appear as vast shadows that dwarf even the largest Imperial vessels, their forms suggesting biological structure on a scale that shouldn't be possible. Whether these represent actual threats or hallucinations induced by the region's peculiar warp-real space interaction remains a matter of debate among the Ordo Malleus, though the number of ships that have vanished without trace suggests the former. Transit times through the Ghoul Stars defy standard warp travel calculations. A journey that should take weeks can stretch into months, or conversely, ships sometimes emerge from the warp at their destinations, with their chronometers showing only days have passed while their crews have aged years. The Navis Nobilite maintains a list of navigator houses that have lost entire bloodlines to the region. their ships found drifting with the navigators' sanctums breached from within, and the occupants reduced to desiccated husks that genetic testing confirms died of extreme old age despite being in their physical prime when they entered the warp. Among the charted systems within the Ghoul Stars, several stand out in Imperial records for their strategic importance or the mysteries they present. The Cataclysm of Souls marks one such system, where 3 planets orbit a dying red giant in such close proximity that their atmospheres bleed into shared space between them. The worlds themselves qualify as death worlds by any Imperial standard, their surfaces scoured by radiation storms and gravitational tides that regularly tear apart continental plates. Yet archaeological evidence suggests these planets once supported human civilization, with ruins that predate the Age of Strife scattered across their broken landscapes. The architecture of these ruins follows no known human cultural pattern, leading some Magos archaeologists to speculate they might represent a lost colony that developed in isolation for so long it became something no longer recognizably human. The Forge world of Mobius exists in a state that the Adeptus Mechanicus officially classifies as suspended operations. The world's forges fell silent during the Age of Strife and have remained so despite multiple attempts by the Mechanicus to reclaim them. Survey teams that land on Mobius report that the facilities appear fully functional, with power still flowing through the manufactorums and assembly lines standing ready for activation. Yet any attempt to restart production results in catastrophic failures that follow no logical pattern. Machines that should work perfectly explode. Assembly servitors turn on their operators despite having no capacity for independent action, and data looms output streams of corrupted code that induces madness in any tech priest who attempts to interpret it. The Fabricator General of Mars issued a standing order in the 38th millennium that Mobius remain sealed until such time as the Omnissiah provides clear guidance on its restoration. The quarantine zones scattered throughout the Ghoul Stars represent some of the oldest continuously enforced Imperial interdictions. These zones bear markers that date back to the Great Crusade itself, placed by authority of the Emperor and carrying seals that indicate the direct involvement of the Sigillite. The specific threats these quarantines contain remain classified at the highest levels of the Inquisition, with access restricted to Inquisitor lords and members of the High Lords of Terra. What little information exists in accessible records indicates these zones contain threats that the Emperor himself deemed too dangerous to destroy, suggesting either the impossibility of their elimination or the potential for catastrophic consequences should they be disturbed. The Pale Wastes represent the largest contiguous quarantine zone, encompassing 17 star systems linked by ancient warp beacons that still function despite their age. Imperial Navy vessels maintain a permanent blockade around the Wastes' perimeter, though the ships rotate out frequently due to the psychological strain of extended deployment. Crews report hearing transmissions in languages that predate human civilization, and augur readings show massive structures in the deep void between the systems that shouldn't exist according to any known engineering principles. The few expeditions authorized to enter the Wastes have either never returned or emerged with their crews reduced to gibbering madness, babbling about cities that grow in the darkness and intelligence that predates the stars themselves. Navigation through the Ghoul Stars requires specialized equipment that most Imperial vessels lack. Certain rogue trader dynasties maintain the ancient charts and modified warp drives necessary for relatively safe passage, though even these experienced voidfarers lose ships to the region with disturbing regularity. The Navis Nobilite charges premium rates for navigators willing to guide vessels through the Ghoul Stars, and even then, only the most desperate or foolhardy captains attempt the journey. The Imperial Navy maintains a handful of patrol routes through the outer regions, but these represent the absolute minimum presence necessary to maintain the fiction of Imperial authority rather than any meaningful control over the territory. The archaeological record of the Ghoul Stars reveals layers of civilization that stretch back beyond humanity's first ventures into the void. Excavations on worlds like Scyther and the shattered moons of the Baal Spine system have uncovered structures that predate human spaceflight by millions of years. These ruins display architectural principles that suggest their builders possessed an understanding of physics that operated on fundamentally different assumptions than those governing Imperial technology. The Adeptus Mechanicus has cataloged over 40 distinct Xenos construction methodologies in the region, each representing a separate species that achieved stellar civilization before vanishing into extinction. The most extensively studied of these ancient cultures left behind what the Ordo Xenos designates as the Scyther Fiend's precursor civilization. The name itself represents a misnomer, as the entities currently inhabiting Scyther bear no genetic relationship to the original builders. Excavations beneath the planet's current nightmare landscape have revealed cities that extend kilometers into the crust, their architecture suggesting beings that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. The structures contain chambers that appear to occupy more internal space than their external dimensions should allow, a property that persists even after millions of years of abandonment. Explorator teams equipped with the most advanced auger arrays report that these spaces register as existing in a state of quantum flux, neither fully present in real space nor entirely translated into the warp. The artifacts recovered from these ancient sites demonstrate technological sophistication that rivals or exceeds humanity's achievements during the dark age of technology. Devices found in sealed vaults beneath the dead cities of the Cataclysm of Souls continue to function despite their age, though their purpose remains obscure. One such artifact, currently stored in a stasis vault on Mars, generates a field that causes time to flow at different rates within its radius of effect. Objects placed near it age rapidly, while others remain perfectly preserved, with no discernible pattern to determine which effect will occur. The Fabricator General has forbidden any attempt to disassemble or reverse engineer the device after an incident where 3 tech priests working on it simultaneously experienced accelerated aging, youth regression, and temporal stasis respectively, with fatal results for all 3. Evidence suggests that multiple Xeno civilizations coexisted in the Ghoul Stars during the period human archaeologists classify as the pre-stellar era. Excavation sites on different worlds have yielded artifacts from distinct cultures in the same stratigraphic layers, indicating they occupied the regions simultaneously. Unlike the typical pattern of one species dominating a territory until displaced by conquest or extinction, the archaeological evidence points to a complex network of interaction between these ancient civilizations. Trade goods from one culture appear in the ruins of others, and certain architectural elements show clear influence between different species' construction techniques. This suggests a level of peaceful coexistence that stands in stark contrast to the galaxy's current state of perpetual warfare. The most disturbing discoveries come from sites that date to the final period before these civilizations vanished. Excavations consistently reveal signs of catastrophic collapse that occurred simultaneously across multiple worlds and species. Cities show evidence of sudden abandonment, with personal effects left in place as if their owners simply ceased to exist mid-activity. Analysis of these sites indicates the populations didn't flee or evacuate, but rather disappeared instantaneously. More troubling still are the structures that appear in the final layers before abandonment, built by hands that no longer matched the anatomical structure of the civilizations that created them. These late-period constructions follow geometries that cause psychological distress in observers, their angles and proportions creating optical effects that shouldn't be possible in 3-dimensional space. The transition from these ancient Xeno civilizations to human settlement occurred during the period Imperial historians designate as the Age of Technology. Human colonization of the Ghoul Stars began during humanity's first great expansion into the galaxy, when generation ships and early warp-capable vessels carried settlers to every corner of known space. The region's stellar charts from this era show a vastly different landscape than exists today. Stars that now barely flicker as dying embers burned bright and steady, providing warmth and light to dozens of inhabited worlds. The colonies established during this period represented the cutting edge of human achievement, equipped with standard template construct technology that allowed them to terraform hostile worlds and establish self-sufficient civilizations within generations. Records from this era, fragmentary as they are, paint a picture of thriving human civilization in what would become the Ghoul Stars. The colony on Mobius achieved particular prominence as a center of innovation in plasma reactor design and gravitational manipulation. Tech archaeological surveys of the world's abandoned facilities have revealed schematics for technologies that exceed anything in the Imperium's current arsenal. One set of plans details a reactor design capable of generating power output equivalent to a small star, while occupying a space no larger than a standard Imperial hab block. Another describes a gravitational lens that could focus and redirect the output of an entire stellar body, effectively weaponizing a sun. The Mechanicus has attempted to reconstruct these designs, but every effort has resulted in catastrophic failure, suggesting the knowledge required to safely implement such technology has been lost. The human colonies maintained extensive stellar engineering projects throughout the region. Evidence of these megastructures remains visible to auger scans, though most exist now only as debris fields and gravitational anomalies. The most ambitious of these projects involved the construction of a network of artificial wormholes designed to create stable transit routes through the region's treacherous warp currents. Fragmentary records recovered from data vaults on abandoned stations indicate the project neared completion before the Age of Strife began. The wormhole network would have allowed instantaneous travel between designated points in real space, bypassing the warp entirely. What remains of these structures exists as tears in spacetime that bleed exotic radiation and occasionally disgorge objects that shouldn't exist according to known physics. The pale wastes contain the most extensive evidence of Dark Age human stellar engineering. Long-range auger scans reveal structures on a scale that defies comprehension, built using construction techniques that suggest the builders could manipulate matter at the atomic level. One such structure, designated Construct Sigma by the Mechanicus, appears to be an artificial planet built around a framework of exotic matter that exists in a state of quantum superposition. The construct measures roughly the size of Terra, but mass is only a fraction of what a natural world of that size should weigh. Its surface shows signs of extensive habitation, with city-sized installations covering every visible hemisphere. No expedition has successfully reached the construct's surface, as ships approaching it experience temporal distortions that cause them to arrive at their destination centuries before or after they departed. The catastrophe that transformed the Ghoul Stars from thriving human territory into a region of death and horror coincided with the onset of Old Night. The warp storms that severed humanity's interstellar civilization affected the region with particular severity. Records from the period immediately preceding the collapse describe astronomical phenomena that shouldn't occur according to established physics. Stars began dying at an accelerated rate, their fusion processes somehow disrupted by forces that operated outside normal spacetime. Planets reported gravitational fluctuations that caused tidal forces strong enough to tear continents apart. The warp itself became violently unstable, with ships attempting translation finding themselves deposited in systems light years from their intended destinations, or emerging into real space centuries displaced from when they entered the Imperium. The human colonies attempted to weather the storm through isolation and self-sufficiency. Communications intercepts from this period, recovered from automated monitoring stations that continued operating long after their creators perished, paint a picture of civilization slowly collapsing under the weight of phenomena it couldn't explain or control. The colony on Scyther reported that their star's output had decreased by 30% over the course of a single solar year, plunging the world into an ice age that killed billions. Mobius transmitted increasingly desperate requests for assistance as their automated systems began behaving erratically, producing goods that didn't match their programming specifications and assembling machines that served no discernible purpose. The final transmission from the Forge world described servitors spontaneously developing consciousness and speaking in languages no human had ever heard. Other colonies reported even stranger occurrences. The settlements in the Cataclysm of Sol system sent messages describing changes in the fundamental constants of physics within their space. Gravity fluctuated randomly, sometimes increasing to levels that crushed buildings and sometimes decreasing until atmosphere began bleeding into space. Light behaved strangely, bending around corners and casting shadows that moved independently of their sources. The colonists reported seeing things in these shadows, entities that existed in the spaces between photons, and observed the humans with what the messages described as hungry intelligence. The final transmission from the system consisted of a single repeated phrase in a language that linguistic analysis suggests represents a corrupted form of High Gothic mixed with phonemes the human vocal apparatus cannot produce. The stellar engineering projects that humanity had constructed throughout the region became sources of disaster rather than triumph. The wormhole network destabilized catastrophically, creating permanent rifts in spacetime that began consuming nearby stellar matter. Several stars disappeared entirely, their mass drawn through these tiers into destinations unknown. The artificial structures orbiting other worlds began exhibiting behavior that suggested they had achieved some form of malevolent sentience. Automated defense platforms turned their weapons on the colonies they were built to protect. Terraforming engines reversed their programming, transforming garden worlds into toxic wastelands within years. Mining installations in asteroid belts began constructing things that served no human purpose, assembling vast structures in the void that radiated frequencies that drove anyone who observed them into homicidal madness. The Mechanicus has developed several theories regarding the role these stellar engineering projects played in the region's transformation. The dominant hypothesis suggests that the projects inadvertently weakened the barrier between real space and the warp, creating conditions that allowed entities from the Imperium to manifest more easily. The concentration of advanced technology in the region, all of it operating on principles that manipulated fundamental forces, may have created a resonance effect that attracted the attention of things that exist beyond human understanding. Alternative theories propose that the projects themselves became corrupted, either through deliberate sabotage by enemies of humanity or through contact with Xenos technology that contained hidden dangers. The fate of the human populations in the Ghoul Stars during Old Night remains one of the great mysteries that Imperial historians continue to investigate. Some colonies simply vanished, their worlds found empty when Imperial expeditionary fleets finally reached the region during the Great Crusade. Others underwent transformations that left their inhabitants no longer recognizably human. The entities encountered on Sithar may represent the descendants of the original human colonists, though genetic analysis proves inconclusive due to the extensive mutations they display. Similar transformed populations exist on other worlds throughout the region, their biology altered so fundamentally that only trace elements of their human ancestry remain detectable. Archaeological evidence from the final days before these colonies fell silent suggests that some populations knew what was happening to them and attempted to resist. Fortifications built during this period show design principles intended to defend against threats that could manifest anywhere within a defended perimeter rather than approaching from outside. Weapons caches contain ammunition types designed to affect targets that exist partially outside normal spacetime. Medical facilities contain research notes describing attempts to develop treatments for conditions that sound like warp corruption, though the colonists lacked the framework to understand what they faced. The notes describe patients who claimed to hear voices in the darkness between stars, who reported seeing impossible colors, and who gradually lost the ability to perceive normal reality as their minds adapted to sensing the warp directly. The most chilling evidence comes from sealed vaults discovered beneath the ruins of major colony centers. These vaults contain messages intended for whoever might eventually find them, warnings recorded by people who knew they faced extinction but hoped to preserve some record of what had destroyed them. The messages describe a darkness that came from beyond the stars, an intelligence vast and patient that had waited in the void since before humanity evolved. They speak of the stars themselves dying not through natural processes, but through deliberate murder, their light consumed by entities that fed on stellar fusion. The final messages warn that the Ghoul Stars represent not an isolated catastrophe, but a preview of what awaits the galaxy, that the darkness spreading through the region will eventually consume all light and life, unless stopped by forces the colonists couldn't imagine. The Emperor's Great Crusade reached the borders of what would become known as the Ghoul Stars during the early decades of the 31st millennium. The expeditionary fleets pushing into the galactic northeast encountered the region's outer systems as they expanded humanity's domain beyond the core world surrounding Terra. Initial survey reports filed by rogue trader scouts and naval reconnaissance vessels described a zone of space that defied standard Imperial classification protocols. The stars burned with the wrong colors, their spectra showing decay patterns that suggested ages far exceeding what stellar formation models predicted. More concerning were the readings from inhabited worlds, where augur returns indicated human populations that registered as genetically divergent from baseline humanity to degrees that suggested either extensive mutation or thousands of years of isolated evolution. The first comprehensive survey missions entered the region in the early decades of the Great Crusade, when the Emperor's forces had secured enough territory in the galactic core to begin pushing toward the frontier regions. These missions consisted of standard expeditionary fleet formations, battle groups of Imperial Navy vessels supported by army regiments and accompanied by representatives from the nascent Adeptus Mechanicus. The fleets carried orders to catalog habitable worlds, assess resources for exploitation, and bring any surviving human populations into compliance with the Imperium. What they found instead were systems that had suffered catastrophes beyond anything the Crusade forces had encountered in their reconquest of the galaxy. Survey teams landing on worlds throughout the region discovered cities that showed signs of violent abandonment. The architecture matched standard template construct patterns from the Dark Age of technology, confirming these had been human colonies of significant sophistication. Yet the populations had vanished under circumstances that defied explanation. Personal effects remained in homes, meals sat half-eaten on tables, and vehicles stood abandoned in streets. Medical facilities contained patients still connected to life support systems that had continued operating for thousands of years, maintaining bodies that had long since decayed to skeletal remains. The survey teams found no bodies beyond these medical cases, no mass graves, no evidence of evacuation. The populations had simply ceased to exist. The Mechanicus contingents attached to these expeditions showed particular interest in the technological artifacts scattered throughout abandoned facilities. Forge complexes on multiple worlds contained manufacturing equipment that exceeded anything Mars possessed, capable of precision assembly at the molecular level. Data repositories held schematics for weapon systems, power generation technologies, and stellar engineering projects that represented the pinnacle of human achievement during the Dark Age. Yet attempts to activate this equipment produced catastrophic results. Machines that appeared perfectly functional exploded when powered on, or worse, began producing objects that served no discernible purpose while consuming enormous amounts of energy. Tech priests who attempted to interface directly with the ancient data systems reported experiencing visions of vast entities moving through the darkness between stars before collapsing into catatonic states. The expeditionary forces encountered their first direct evidence of hostile Xenos presence when survey teams reached the inner systems of the region. Worlds that augur scans indicated should support human life instead harbored populations of creatures that bore only superficial resemblance to humanity. The entities on Sithar represented the most extensively documented of these populations. Initial observations suggested a human colony that had undergone severe mutation, possibly through exposure to warp phenomena or Xenos biological agents. Closer examination revealed the truth to be far worse. The creatures possessed biological structures that incorporated organs and tissues from multiple different species, assembled in configurations that suggested deliberate engineering rather than natural evolution. Their behavior patterns indicated intelligence and social organization, but their technology operated on principles that violated established physics. Contact attempts with these populations ended in disaster. Landing parties that approached the settlements on Scyther reported via Vox that the inhabitants responded with hostility, though their weapons appeared to be biological in nature rather than technological. The creatures possessed the ability to project force through means that the Imperial forces couldn't detect or counter. Soldiers reported feeling their bodies beginning to change, their flesh rippling and reforming into new configurations. Those who survived extraction showed signs of rapid mutation that required immediate quarantine. Medical examination revealed that their genetic structure had been rewritten at the cellular level, with Xenos' DNA sequences replacing human genes in patterns that suggested intelligent design. The infected soldiers died within hours, their bodies collapsing into masses of undifferentiated tissue that continued to grow and change even after death. The expeditionary fleets transmitted reports back to Terra, describing a region that posed threats beyond standard military engagement. The Administratum officials reviewing these reports recommended extreme caution in any further expansion into the area. The world showed clear signs of valuable resources and technology, but the hostile populations and unexplained phenomena presented risks that standard Crusade protocols weren't designed to handle. Several high-ranking Imperial commanders argued for committing significant military resources to cleanse the region, but the logistical challenges of maintaining supply lines across such vast distances while dealing with unpredictable warp routes made large-scale operations impractical. Despite these warnings, several expeditionary forces pushed deeper into the Ghoul Stars during the middle decades of the 31st millennium. These fleets consisted of standard Crusade formations, typically numbering between 50 and 100 vessels, including battleships, cruisers, and support craft. They carried full army regiments along with their equipment and supplies for extended campaigns. Some included detachments of Space Marines from various legions, though the primary fighting forces remained the Imperial army units that formed the backbone of the Great Crusade's military might. These expeditions maintained regular astropathic communication with their command structures, transmitting survey data and status reports as they advanced into the region's interior systems. The astropathic messages from these deeper expeditions grew increasingly disturbing as the fleets penetrated further into the Ghoul Stars. Astropaths receiving these transmissions reported that the messages arrived corrupted, their psychic signatures distorted by interference that suggested something was actively attempting to block or alter the communications. The content of the messages described phenomena that challenged the expeditionary forces' understanding of reality. Stars that moved from their charted positions, planets that appeared and disappeared from auger scans, and spatial anomalies that caused ships to arrive at destinations light years from where they intended to translate from the warp. Fleet commanders reported losing contact with individual vessels that simply vanished from formation without warning, their last transmissions cut off mid-sentence. One expedition transmitted a series of messages describing the discovery of a massive artificial structure in deep space between star systems. The structure measured hundreds of kilometers across and appeared to be actively growing, consuming asteroids and stellar debris to add to its mass. Auger scans indicated the presence of life signs inside, numbering in the billions, though the signatures didn't match any known biological pattern. The fleet commander ordered a closer investigation, and the expedition's final coherent transmission described boarding parties entering the structure through openings that appeared to form in its hull as they approached. The astropathic message ended abruptly, and subsequent attempts to contact the fleet received only silence. Naval vessels sent to investigate years later found no trace of either the expedition or the structure it had discovered. Another expeditionary force transmitted increasingly frantic messages describing attacks by vessels that appeared to be of human origin, but showed design modifications that served no logical purpose. The attacking ships incorporated organic components into their hulls, with what appeared to be living tissue growing across their armor plating. These vessels demonstrated capabilities that exceeded anything in the Imperial Navy's arsenal, accelerating at rates that should have crushed their crews and making warp translations without the standard preparation time required for safe Imperium travel. The expedition's final transmission described their flagship being boarded by creatures that wore Imperial Army uniforms, but possessed anatomies that were fundamentally wrong, their limbs bending at joints that humans didn't possess, and their faces showing features that shifted and changed as they moved. The Mechanicus expeditions that ventured into the Ghoul Stars sent back reports that particularly troubled the tech priests on Mars. Several explorator fleets discovered worlds where the ancient forges from the dark age of technology had reactivated spontaneously. The manufactorums operated at full capacity, their assembly lines producing goods that piled up in warehouses with no one to use them. Closer investigation revealed that the products emerging from these facilities didn't match their original design specifications. Weapons came off the lines with modifications that made them more lethal, but also unstable, prone to exploding and killing their users. Medical equipment produced devices that claimed to heal, but actually induced rapid cellular mutation. The tech priests attempting to shut down these rogue facilities found that the machine spirits inhabiting the forges had become corrupted, no longer responding to standard protocols and actively resisting attempts to deactivate them. The Space Marine legions that participated in operations within the Ghoul Stars filed after action reports that described combat against enemies that shouldn't exist. Several engagements involved fighting against what appeared to be other Space Marines, warriors wearing power armor that bore Legion colors and heraldry. Yet these opponents fought with tactics and weapons that no Legion used, and their armor incorporated modifications that suggested Xenos technology or warp corruption. Gene seed analysis of recovered bodies proved inconclusive, showing markers that indicated Space Marine origin, but with genetic sequences that had been altered beyond recognition. The apothecaries examining these remains recommended immediate incineration and filed reports with their Legion command's warning of potential corruption that could spread through gene seed contact. The Imperial forces discovered numerous derelict vessels drifting through the void in the Ghoul Stars' interior systems. These ships bore Imperial markings and identification codes, but their crews had met fates that defied explanation. Some vessels were found completely empty, their entire complement vanished without sign of struggle or evacuation. Life support systems remained operational, meals sat prepared in galleys, and personal effects remained in crew quarters. The ship's logs showed normal operations up until a specific moment when all entries simply stopped, with no indication of what had happened to the thousands of personnel who should have been aboard. Other derelict vessels contained their crews, but in states that required immediate quarantine protocols. Bodies found aboard these ships showed signs of extreme mutation that had occurred while the victims still lived. Medical examination revealed that the transformations had been gradual, with crew members' biology changing over weeks or months. Ship logs from these vessels, where they remained accessible, described a progressive deterioration of crew health and sanity. Personnel reported hearing voices in the ship's ventilation systems, seeing movement in shadows where nothing should exist, and experiencing vivid dreams of vast intelligences watching them from the darkness between stars. The final log entries typically described the crew turning on each other as mutations became visible, with officers ordering the execution of transformed personnel before succumbing to the changes themselves. The most disturbing discoveries involved vessels where the crews had undergone coordinated transformation. These ships showed signs of deliberate modification, with their internal structures altered to serve purposes that made no sense for human habitation. Corridors had been reshaped into configurations that human anatomy couldn't comfortably navigate, with passages that twisted at angles that caused spatial disorientation. Life support systems had been modified to maintain atmospheric conditions that would kill baseline humans, with oxygen levels reduced and exotic gases introduced. The crews aboard these vessels had changed to survive in these new environments, their bodies adapting in ways that suggested either incredibly rapid evolution or deliberate biological engineering. These transformed crews sometimes remained active, attacking any Imperial forces that boarded their vessels with ferocity that exceeded normal human capability. The accumulating evidence from these expeditions led to high-level discussions within the Imperial command structure about the appropriate response to the Ghoul Stars. The region clearly contained threats that posed significant dangers to Imperial forces, but it also held valuable resources and technology that could benefit the Crusade. The debate centered on whether the potential gains justified the risks of continued operations in such a hostile environment. Several Lord Commanders argued for a massive military commitment to cleanse the region systematically, bringing in multiple Legion forces and establishing permanent garrison bases. Others advocated for complete withdrawal and the establishment of quarantine protocols to prevent whatever was corrupting the region from spreading into Imperial-controlled space. The decision ultimately came down in favor of establishing the Ghoul Stars as a restricted zone. Imperial authorities designated the region as requiring special authorization for any expedition or settlement attempt. The Navy established patrol routes along the region's borders, maintaining a presence sufficient to monitor any threats emerging from the interior while avoiding deep penetration into the most dangerous systems. The quarantine protocols forbade large-scale colonization efforts and limited commercial traffic to registered rogue trader vessels operating under strict guidelines. Violations of these restrictions carried severe penalties, including execution for ship captains and the seizure of all vessels and cargo involved in unauthorized expeditions. The establishment of the Death Specters chapter occurred during the Second Founding in the early 31st millennium, though the exact circumstances surrounding their creation remain shrouded in the same secrecy that characterizes their operations. Official records from the Administratum list them among the chapters created from the Raven Guard Legion's gene seed, though this designation carries notations indicating uncertainty. The chapter's own records, what little has been shared with Imperial authorities, neither confirm nor deny this lineage. Their gene seed displays characteristics consistent with Raven Guard stock, including the melanochrome deficiency that prevents their skin from darkening in response to radiation exposure, leaving their battle brothers with the pale complexion typical of Corax's sons. However, certain genetic markers present in Death Specters' gene seed don't match any known Raven Guard successor chapter, suggesting either mutation accumulated over millennia or a more complex origin than official records indicate. The chapter received their founding mandate directly from the highest levels of Imperial authority, with orders that specified their unique purpose within the Imperium's military structure. Unlike most Space Marine chapters created during the Second Founding, the Death Specters weren't assigned to Crusade fleets or given mobile operational parameters. Their charter designated them as Sentinels, tasked with maintaining permanent vigilance over the Ghoul Stars region and containing any threats that emerged from that cursed space. The decision to dedicate an entire chapter to this purpose reflected the serious concern Imperial Command held regarding the region following the disastrous expeditions of the Great Crusade. The losses suffered by those expeditionary forces, combined with the evidence of corruption and transformation affecting Imperial personnel who spent extended periods in the region, convinced the Imperium's leadership that conventional military responses would prove inadequate. The Death Specters established their fortress monastery on Occludus, a world positioned at the edge of the Ghoul Stars proper. The planet orbits a dying red giant that provides minimal illumination, leaving Occludus in perpetual twilight. The world's surface consists primarily of rocky highlands broken by deep chasms that descend kilometers into the crust. These chasms contain the remnants of human settlement from the Dark Age of technology, cities built into the cliff faces and extending deep underground. The original colonists adapted to Occludus's dim conditions by constructing their civilization in the depths, where geothermal energy provided power and heat. When the Death Specters arrived to claim the world, they found these underground cities empty. Their populations vanished like so many other colonies in the region. The chapter took possession of the largest of these subterranean complexes, converting the ancient hab blocks and industrial facilities into the fortress monastery that serves as their primary base of operations. The fortress monastery extends through multiple levels carved into Occludus's bedrock, with some sections reaching depths of over 10 kilometers beneath the surface. The upper levels contain the standard facilities required by a Space Marine chapter, training halls where neophytes learn the arts of war, armories stocked with the weapons and equipment necessary for the chapter's operations, and apothecarians where the chapter's medical staff maintain the gene seed and tend to wounded battle brothers. The deeper levels house more specialized facilities that reflect the Death Specter's unique operational requirements. Extensive archives contain every scrap of information the chapter has gathered about the Ghoul Stars over millennia of observation, from star charts showing the positions of dying stellar bodies to detailed reports of encounters with the region's hostile inhabitants. Isolation chambers allow battle brothers to train in conditions of complete sensory deprivation, preparing them for operations in the lightless void between stars where standard visual input becomes useless. The chapter's recruitment practices differ significantly from most Space Marine chapters due to Occludus's limited population. The world supports only scattered communities of humans who survive by mining the mineral deposits in the deep chasms and maintaining the ancient geothermal plants that provide power. These communities number in the thousands rather than millions, providing a recruitment pool far smaller than most chapters draw from. The Death Specters compensate for this limitation by maintaining recruitment rights on several other worlds in systems adjacent to the Ghoul Stars. These worlds share similar characteristics to Occludus, existing in systems where dying stars provide minimal light and human populations have adapted to live in conditions of near-constant darkness. The inhabitants of these worlds develop the psychological resilience necessary to function in environments where shadows hold real dangers, and the absence of light becomes a constant companion rather than a temporary condition. Aspirants selected for recruitment undergo trials that test their ability to operate in complete darkness and maintain mental stability when isolated from all external stimuli. The chapter's chaplains take potential neophytes into the deepest levels of the fortress monastery, chambers that exist in absolute darkness, where even the enhanced senses of Space Marines struggle to detect their surroundings. The aspirants must navigate these spaces using only their other senses, learning to detect threats through sound, air movement, and instinct rather than sight. Those who succeed demonstrate the mental fortitude required to serve in a chapter that operates in conditions most humans would find psychologically unbearable. The trials claim the lives of many aspirants, with failure often resulting in death from falls into bottomless chasms or encounters with the blind predators that inhabit Occludus's deepest caves. The Death Specters maintain a fleet strength unusual for a chapter of their size and operational mandate. Where most chapters operate a handful of strike cruisers and supporting vessels, the Death Specters possess over a dozen capital ships and numerous escorts. This expanded fleet allows them to maintain multiple patrol routes simultaneously throughout the Ghoul Stars region, ensuring that no major threat can emerge without detection. The chapter's vessels incorporate modifications that enhance their capability for extended operations in deep space, far from any support infrastructure. Their ships carry expanded fuel reserves, oversized supply holds, and redundant life support systems that allow them to remain on station for years without resupply. The machine spirits inhabiting these vessels have adapted to the unique conditions of the Ghoul Stars, developing what the chapter's tech marines describe as an unusual level of autonomy in responding to the spatial anomalies and warp disturbances common in the region. The chapter's flagship, the Wraith of Occludus, serves as a mobile command center for Death Specters operations throughout the region. The vessel began its service as a standard battle barge during the Second Founding, but millennia of modifications have transformed it into something unique within the Imperial Navy's classification system. The Wraith mounts weapon systems salvaged from derelict ships found drifting in the Ghoul Stars, some of which operate on principles that the Adeptus Mechanicus cannot fully explain. Its auger arrays incorporate technology recovered from Dark Age facilities on abandoned worlds, providing detection capabilities that exceed standard Imperial systems. The ship's Geller fields have been reinforced with additional generators that create overlapping protective barriers, a necessary precaution given the frequency of warp anomalies in the region. The Wraith rarely returns to Occludus, spending decades at a time on patrol through the Ghoul Stars, while the chapter's other vessels rotate back for maintenance and resupply. The Death Spectres developed combat doctrines specifically tailored to the threats they face in the Ghoul Stars. Their tactical approach emphasizes void warfare and boarding actions, reflecting the reality that most engagements in the region occur in deep space rather than on planetary surfaces. The chapter's battle brothers train extensively in zero-gravity combat, learning to fight in conditions where up and down become meaningless concepts and momentum becomes as dangerous as enemy fire. They practice breaching techniques designed to penetrate the hulls of vessels that may not follow standard Imperial construction patterns, using specialized equipment that can cut through armor plating of unknown composition. Their boarding tactics focus on rapid strikes deep into enemy vessels, targeting critical systems and command centers rather than attempting to control entire ships. Combat in lightless environments represents another area where the Death Spectres have developed specialized expertise. The darkness that pervades much of the Ghoul Stars renders standard visual targeting systems ineffective, forcing the chapter to rely on alternative methods of detecting and engaging enemies. Their armor incorporates enhanced audio sensors that can detect movement through vibration and sound, while specialized helmets provide thermal imaging capabilities that function even in the near absolute zero temperatures of deep space. The chapter's battle brothers learn to fight without relying on sight, using their other enhanced senses to track enemies and coordinate with their brothers. This training proves essential when facing threats that exist partially outside normal space, entities that don't reflect light in ways that standard optics can process. The Death Spectres employ weapons and equipment adapted to their operational environment. Their bolters carry specialized ammunition types designed to function in extreme conditions, with propellant mixtures that ignite reliably even in the cold of deep space, and warheads that can penetrate armor made from materials that shouldn't exist according to Imperial materials science. Their power weapons incorporate additional shielding that prevents the energy fields from destabilizing when exposed to the exotic radiation common in the Ghoul Stars. The chapter's Techmarines maintain extensive workshops aboard the fleet vessels, constantly modifying and adapting equipment based on lessons learned from each engagement. This flexibility in equipment modification stands in contrast to the rigid adherence to established patterns typical of most chapters, but the unique threats in the Ghoul Stars demand adaptability over orthodoxy. The chapter maintains extensive intelligence networks throughout the region, gathering information through methods that remain classified even from other Imperial authorities. They operate listening posts on dead worlds throughout the Ghoul Stars, automated stations that monitor communications and track vessel movements. These stations relay their data through a network of relay beacons that the chapter has established over millennia, creating a communication system that functions despite the interference that renders standard Imperial Vox systems unreliable. The Death Spectres also maintain contact with the few human populations that survive in the region, isolated communities on worlds that haven't yet fallen to the corruption that claimed so many colonies. These populations provide information about local conditions and serve as early warning systems for emerging threats, though the chapter maintains strict protocols regarding contact to prevent contamination. The secretive nature of the Death Spectres extends beyond their gene seed lineage to encompass virtually every aspect of their operations. They rarely communicate with other Imperial forces, except when coordinating responses to threats that exceed their capacity to contain alone. Their battle brothers speak little even among themselves, communicating through hand signals and encrypted Vox channels when words become necessary. The chapter's records remain sealed from outside inspection, with access restricted to the chapter master and his senior officers. Even the Inquisition finds itself denied entry to the Death Spectre's archives, a situation that has created tension between the chapter and certain ordos, but which the chapter maintains is necessary to prevent information about the Ghoul Stars from spreading beyond those who need to know. The Death Spectre's relationship with other Imperial institutions reflects their isolation and independence. They maintain minimal contact with the Administratum beyond submitting the required status reports, and those reports contain only the barest information necessary to satisfy bureaucratic requirements. Their dealings with the Adeptus Mechanicus focus primarily on equipment maintenance and resupply, with the chapter's techmarines handling most technical matters internally rather than requesting assistance from Forge worlds. The chapter recruits its own librarians rather than sending psychers to Terra for training, a practice that has raised questions about their adherence to the Codex Astartes, but which the chapter justifies as necessary given the specialized knowledge required to operate safely in the Ghoul Stars. The psychological toll of operating in the Ghoul Stars affects even the Death Specters despite their conditioning and training. Battle brothers who serve extended tour in the region's interior systems report experiencing sensations that suggest warp exposure, though their librarians detect no evidence of corruption. These sensations include the feeling of being watched by vast intelligences, auditory hallucinations of voices speaking in languages that predate human civilization, and visual distortions where the darkness between stars appears to move with purpose. The chapter's chaplains work constantly to maintain the spiritual health of their brothers, conducting rituals designed to strengthen mental resistance to these phenomena. Some battle brothers never fully recover from their experiences, requiring permanent assignment to duties on Occludus, where the fortress monastery's consecrated halls provide protection from the psychological pressure that pervades the region. The Sither Fiends represent the most extensively documented Xenos threat emerging from the Ghoul Stars, though documentation in this case means fragmentary reports compiled from survivors who witnessed these creatures and lived to transmit their accounts. The species takes its name from the world of Sither, a planet deep within the Ghoul Stars that serves as their apparent origin point, though whether they evolved there naturally or arrived from elsewhere remains unknown. Imperial xenobiological analysis of recovered specimens reveals organisms that defy standard classification protocols, possessing biological structures that incorporate elements from multiple distinct evolutionary paths in ways that suggest either impossibly rapid adaptive evolution or deliberate genetic engineering by an intelligence that understood biology at levels beyond even the most advanced Magos biologists. The physical form of a Sither fiend combines insectoid and crustacean characteristics with elements that appear almost vertebrate in nature. Adult specimens stand between 2 and 3 meters tall when in their standard locomotion posture, though their segmented bodies allow them to compress or extend their height significantly. Their exoskeletons consist of chitin-like material that analysis reveals contains molecular structures incorporating metals that shouldn't exist in biological organisms. This exoskeleton demonstrates remarkable durability, capable of withstanding small arms fire that would kill most organic creatures. The chitin displays a dark coloration that absorbs light rather than reflecting it, making the fiends difficult to detect visually in the low light conditions common throughout the Ghoul Stars. When damaged, the exoskeleton regenerates at rates that suggest accelerated cellular activity beyond anything seen in natural healing processes. The creatures possess multiple limbs arranged in configurations that vary between individual specimens. Most commonly observed fiends display 6 primary limbs, with the forward pair adapted for manipulation and combat, while the remaining 4 provide locomotion. However, reports exist of specimens with 8, 10, or even 12 limbs, suggesting either significant variation within the species or the presence of multiple subspecies adapted for different purposes. The forward limbs terminate in appendages that can function as both hands and weapons, with retractable claws capable of penetrating ceramite armor. These claws secrete a substance that Imperial analysis identifies as an extremely potent acid that continues dissolving material even after the initial wound, making injuries from Scyther fiend attacks particularly difficult to treat. The head structure of these creatures presents perhaps their most disturbing feature. Multiple sensory organs cluster around a central feeding orifice, with compound eyes that provide nearly 360-degree vision and antennae that detect chemical signatures across distances of several kilometers. The feeding orifice itself contains multiple rows of serrated structures that serve to both grip and process prey. Xenobiological examination of deceased specimens reveals that their digestive systems can process virtually any organic matter, with stomach acids capable of breaking down materials that human digestive systems would find completely indigestible. More disturbing still are the vocal organs, which allow the fiends to produce sounds across a frequency range far exceeding human capability. Survivors of fiend attacks report hearing vocalizations that cause intense psychological distress, suggesting the creatures can produce infrasonic frequencies that directly affect human neurological function. The Scyther fiends demonstrate intelligence that clearly exceeds simple animal cunning. Their behavior patterns indicate complex social organization and strategic thinking. Observations of fiend raiding parties show coordinated tactical maneuvers that suggest communication and planning. They employ flanking movements, establish ambush positions, and adapt their tactics based on enemy responses in ways that indicate genuine problem-solving capability. Some xenobiological researchers theorize that the fiends possess a form of hive mind, with individual specimens linked through some form of psychic or pheromonal network that allows them to share information instantaneously. This theory gains support from observations that fiends separated from their main force continue to coordinate their actions as if they maintained constant communication, even when no detectable signals pass between them. The technology employed by Scyther fiends represents another area where they defy standard xenobiological classification. Unlike most insectoid Xenos species encountered by the Imperium, which typically rely on biological weapons and structures, the fiends utilize manufactured tools and weapons. Their technology incorporates both organic and inorganic components in ways that blur the distinction between living tissue and mechanical device. Weapons recovered from dead fiends appear to be partially alive, with components that pulse and flex as if breathing. These weapons operate through principles that Imperial tech priests struggle to understand, generating energy through biological processes rather than standard power sources. The weapons demonstrate remarkable efficiency, producing destructive output that exceeds their apparent size and mass. Fiend vessels encountered in deep space display similar biomechanical characteristics. Their ships possess hulls that appear to be grown rather than constructed, with organic components integrated throughout their structure. These vessels demonstrate capabilities that exceed most Imperial ship classes of comparable size. They accelerate at rates that should tear apart their hulls, suggesting either incredibly advanced inertial dampening or structural integrity beyond what their apparent construction should allow. The ships navigate through the Ghoul Stars without apparent difficulty, moving through regions where spatial anomalies and warp disturbances render Imperial navigation nearly impossible. This suggests the fiends possess either innate resistance to these phenomena or technology that allows them to predict and avoid the worst effects. The reproductive cycle of Scyther fiends remains poorly understood, though captured specimens provide some insight into their biology. Female fiends, distinguishable from males by their larger size and additional limb segments, produce eggs in clutches of 20 to 30 at a time. These eggs require living hosts to develop properly, with the fiend larvae consuming the host from within as they mature. This parasitic reproduction explains the fiend's preference for capturing living prey rather than simply killing enemies encountered during their raids. Human captives taken by fiend raiding parties face the horrific fate of serving as incubators for the next generation, kept alive through unknown means while larvae develop inside their bodies. The few individuals recovered from fiend nests before the larvae fully mature require immediate mercy killing, as the internal damage caused by the developing creatures makes survival impossible even with the most advanced Imperial medical intervention. The Fiends conduct raids into Imperial space with disturbing regularity, emerging from the depths of the Ghoul Stars to attack isolated outposts, merchant vessels, and even defended Imperial Navy installations. These raids follow patterns that suggest specific objectives rather than random aggression. The Fiends target facilities that contain large concentrations of human populations, particularly those with minimal military defenses. They strike quickly, overwhelming defenders through superior numbers and coordination before Imperial reinforcements can arrive. The raiders capture as many living humans as possible, using specialized equipment that appears designed specifically for subduing and transporting prisoners. Victims are paralyzed through injected toxins that leave them conscious but unable to move, ensuring they remain alive during transport back to Fiend-controlled territory. Imperial forces that have responded to Fiend attacks find scenes of devastation that reveal the creature's methodology. Facilities show signs of systematic searching, with the Fiends breaking into sealed sections and overriding security measures to access areas where personnel might shelter. Bodies of defenders display wounds from Fiend weapons and claws, but casualties remain relatively low compared to the number of people reported missing. This pattern confirms that the Fiends prioritize capture over killing, taking prisoners whenever possible and eliminating only those who actively resist or cannot be subdued. The psychological impact on survivors proves almost as devastating as the physical damage, with witnesses reporting nightmares and psychological trauma that persists long after the attack. Naval engagements with Fiend vessels demonstrate their tactical sophistication and technological capabilities. Fiend ships avoid direct confrontation with superior Imperial forces, instead employing hit-and-run tactics that exploit their superior speed and maneuverability. They target isolated vessels or small convoys, overwhelming them before help can arrive. During boarding actions, Fiend warriors demonstrate combat capabilities that challenge even Space Marine defenders. Their natural armor withstands bolter fire that would kill most Xenos, while their weapons penetrate power armor with disturbing ease. The creatures fight with a coordination that suggests constant communication, responding instantly to changing battlefield conditions and exploiting any weakness in Imperial defensive formations. The fate of those captured by Scyther Fiends varies depending on the raiders' immediate needs. Some prisoners serve as hosts for Fiend larvae, as previously described. Others disappear into the depths of Scyther itself, their ultimate fate unknown but presumably horrific based on the few accounts from individuals who escaped Fiend captivity. These rare survivors describe vast underground complexes where the Fiends maintain what appear to be breeding facilities on a massive scale. Thousands of human prisoners exist in these facilities, kept alive in conditions that barely qualify as survival. The Fiends possess technology that maintains human life even under extreme duress, preventing death while the captives serve whatever purpose the creatures require. Survivors who spent extended periods in Fiend captivity often display signs of genetic alteration, with their biology showing markers that suggest exposure to mutagenic substances or deliberate genetic manipulation. The Imperium has attempted multiple times to mount major offensive operations against Scyther and other Fiend-controlled worlds, seeking to eliminate the threat at its source. These expeditions invariably end in disaster. The Ghoul Stars' hostile environment complicates any large-scale military operation, with warp routes that make reliable fleet movements nearly impossible and spatial anomalies that separate task forces from their support elements. The Fiends demonstrate advanced knowledge of Imperial fleet movements, suggesting either sophisticated detection capabilities or some form of precognitive ability. They ambush Imperial forces in deep space, attacking supply lines and isolating combat vessels from their logistics support. Those forces that reach Scyther itself face defenses that incorporate both advanced technology and the planet's hostile environment, with the Fiends using the world's geography and atmospheric conditions to their advantage. Beyond the Scyther Fiends, the Ghoul Stars harbor numerous other Xenos species that pose varying degrees of threat to Imperial interests. Many of these species remain unclassified by Imperial xenobiological authorities, their existence known only through fragmentary reports from explorers and military forces that encountered them. Some appear to be native to the region, having evolved in the unique conditions created by the dying stars and spatial anomalies. Others seem to have arrived from elsewhere in the galaxy, possibly fleeing extinction or seeking refuge in a region where Imperial authority remains minimal. The concentration of diverse Xeno species in such a relatively small area of space suggests the Ghoul Stars serve some function that attracts or sustains non-human life forms. Reports from Death Specters patrols describe encounters with organisms that defy Imperial classification systems. One species, designated Specimen Gamma 7 in Death Specters records, exists as a form of space-borne life that feeds on stellar radiation. These creatures measure hundreds of meters in length, with bodies that appear almost gaseous in consistency. They drift through the void between stars, absorbing energy from dying stellar bodies. While generally non-hostile, they pose significant hazards to navigation as their bodies disrupt auger systems, and their presence creates gravitational anomalies that can pull ships off course. More concerning are reports that these creatures sometimes aggregate in large numbers, forming clusters that block entire transit routes through the region. Another species encountered with disturbing frequency consists of organisms that exist partially outside normal spacetime. Imperial forces report seeing these creatures as shadowy forms that move through solid matter as if it doesn't exist. They appear to phase in and out of reality, making them nearly impossible to target with conventional weapons. The few specimens that Imperial forces have managed to kill dissipate upon death, leaving no physical remains for study. Survivors of encounters with these entities describe feeling intense cold and experiencing temporal distortions, with seconds seeming to stretch into hours or entire minutes passing in what feels like instants. The creatures appear drawn to sources of psychic energy, showing particular interest in attacking psychers and navigators. Deep space monitoring stations maintained by the Death Specters have detected massive organisms moving through the void at the edge of the Ghoul Stars region. These creatures measure kilometers in length, their forms suggesting some kind of space-adapted megafauna. Long-range auger scans reveal biological structures on a scale that shouldn't be possible according to Imperial understanding of physics and biology. These entities appear to feed on stellar matter, approaching dying stars and somehow extracting energy or material from them. Whether they represent a natural species that evolved to exploit the unique conditions in the Ghoul Stars or artificial creations designed for some unknown purpose remains unclear. The Death Specters maintain strict observation protocols regarding these creatures, tracking their movements but avoiding direct contact due to their enormous size and unknown capabilities. The theory that the Ghoul Stars serve as a refuge for Xeno species fleeing extinction elsewhere in the galaxy gains support from the diversity of organisms encountered in the region. Many species found here exist nowhere else in known space, suggesting they represent the last survivors of once widespread populations. The region's hostile environment and minimal Imperial presence make it an ideal hiding place for species that have been driven from their original territories by Imperial expansion, orc invasions, or Tyrannid hive fleets. The spatial anomalies and warp disturbances that make the region so dangerous for Imperial forces may actually provide protection for Xenos populations, creating natural barriers that limit outside interference. Some xenobiological researchers theorize that the Ghoul Stars may function as more than just a refuge, possibly serving as a spawning ground where new species emerge through accelerated evolution or genetic manipulation. The high background radiation from dying stars creates mutagenic conditions that could drive rapid evolutionary change. The presence of ancient technology from multiple extinct civilizations provides potential tools for deliberate genetic engineering. Evidence exists of facilities on several worlds where biological experiments of massive scale were conducted, though whether these date from the dark age of technology or represent the work of even older civilizations remains uncertain. These facilities contain equipment that appears designed for manipulating genetic material and creating new life forms, suggesting that at least some of the Xeno species in the region may represent artificial creations rather than naturally evolved organisms. The Ordo Xenos maintains extensive files on threats emerging from the Ghoul Stars, though much of this information remains classified at the highest levels. Inquisitors who specialize in studying the region have developed theories that connect the various Xeno species to larger patterns of threat facing the Imperium. Some propose that the concentration of hostile Xenos in the Ghoul Stars represents preparation for a major invasion of Imperial space, with multiple species coordinating their efforts toward a common goal. Others suggest the region serves as a testing ground where Xenos factions experiment with new biological weapons and technologies before deploying them elsewhere. The most disturbing theories propose that something in the Ghoul Stars actively draws Xeno species to the region, some form of intelligence or force that collects and studies alien life forms for purposes the Imperium cannot fathom. The warp storms that plague the Ghoul Stars exceed in frequency and intensity anything encountered in most other regions of Imperial space. Standard Imperial navigation protocols assume a baseline level of Empyrean turbulence that navigators can work around through skill and experience, but the Ghoul Stars operate under different rules. The region experiences warp storms with such regularity that Imperial cartographers cannot maintain accurate charts of safe passage routes for more than a few years before the information becomes obsolete. These storms manifest without the warning signs that typically precede major warp disturbances, appearing suddenly in regions where augur readings indicated stable conditions moments before. Ships caught in these unexpected storms face destruction or worse, their gellar fields overwhelmed by the sudden surge of Empyrean energy that tears through the barrier between real space and the immaterium. The nature of these warp storms differs from those observed elsewhere in the galaxy. Standard warp storms, while dangerous, follow patterns that Imperial observers have documented over millennia of space travel. They build gradually, reach peak intensity, then dissipate over predictable timeframes. The storms in the Ghoul Stars behave erratically, intensifying and weakening without apparent cause. Some persist for centuries in the same location, creating permanent barriers that render entire systems inaccessible. Others flash into existence for mere hours before vanishing completely, leaving no trace of their presence beyond the wreckage of ships caught in their fury. Naval officers who have operated in the region describe attempting to navigate around a storm only to have it shift position, moving through space in ways that storms shouldn't be able to move, almost as if guided by hostile intelligence. Reality tears represent perhaps the most disturbing manifestation of warp corruption in the Ghoul Stars. These phenomena occur where the barrier between real space and the immaterium has degraded to the point of complete failure, creating permanent wounds in the fabric of existence. Unlike temporary warp rifts that close once the energies sustaining them dissipate, these tears persist indefinitely. They range in size from small breaches, measuring mere meters, across to massive ruptures that span entire star systems. Ships approaching these tiers report severe gellar field strain even while in real space, with their protective barriers struggling against Empyrean energies that bleed through into normal space. The tiers themselves appear as regions where space takes on properties that violate established physics, with light bending at impossible angles and matter behaving according to rules that shift moment to moment. Imperial survey teams that have studied these reality tiers from what they consider safe distances report phenomena that challenge their understanding of how the universe functions. Objects near the tiers age at accelerated or decelerated rates, with some materials crumbling to dust in seconds, while others remain perfectly preserved despite exposure to conditions that should destroy them. Gravitational forces fluctuate wildly, sometimes intensifying to levels that crush ships into compacted metal and other times weakening, until objects drift apart at the molecular level. Temporal distortions create zones where time flows at different rates, with observers watching events unfold at impossible speeds or seeing motion slow to near complete stasis. The few instruments that continue functioning near these tiers record data that makes no sense, showing readings that contradict each other or indicate conditions that cannot exist simultaneously. The concentration of these reality tiers in the Ghoul Stars far exceeds what Imperial authorities observe in other regions, even those known for warp instability. The Adeptus Cartographicae maintains records showing that the Ghoul Stars contain more permanent warp rifts than entire segmentums elsewhere in the Imperium. This abnormal concentration suggests something about the region either attracts these phenomena or actively generates them. Some inquisitors of the Ordo Malleus theorize that the ancient stellar engineering projects from the Dark Age of technology weaken the barrier between dimensions, creating conditions where reality tiers form more easily. Others propose that the region's unusual stellar composition, with its high concentration of dying stars and exotic stellar remnants, somehow affects the warp in ways that standard Imperial metaphysical models cannot account for. Reports compiled by the Inquisition over millennia describe worlds within the Ghoul Stars that have undergone complete corruption by chaos. These demon worlds represent territory where the material universe has been completely subsumed by the immaterium, transformed into realms where the laws of physics bow to the will of the ruinous powers. The existence of such worlds deep within the region comes as no surprise to those familiar with the Ghoul Stars, given the prevalence of warp storms and reality tiers. What concerns Imperial authorities more is the evidence that these corrupted worlds serve as staging grounds for chaos incursions into surrounding systems, spreading their taint outward like a malignant growth consuming healthy tissue. The world designated Mire in Imperial records exemplifies the horror of chaos corruption in the Ghoul Stars. Once a productive mining colony during the Dark Age of technology, Mire now exists as a realm where reality itself has been rewritten according to the whims of Nurgle. The planet's surface consists of endless swamps filled with diseased water that teems with demonic life. Structures that once housed millions of workers have transformed into organic growths that pulse with unnatural vitality, their walls composed of living tissue that bleeds when damaged. The atmosphere carries plagues that kill within hours of exposure, though death brings no release as Nurgle's power reanimates corpses to serve as hosts for demonic entities. Imperial Navy vessels maintaining the quarantine around Mire report that the corruption spreads beyond the planet itself, with ships that approach too closely developing mechanical failures that resemble organic disease, their systems rotting from within despite being composed of metal and ceramite. Another corrupted world, known in fragmentary records as V-Halax, shows the influence of Tzeentch in its impossible architecture and constantly shifting geography. Reconnaissance data gathered by long-range augurs shows cities that rebuild themselves continuously, their structures flowing like liquid while maintaining structural integrity. Buildings twist into configurations that hurt to observe, their geometry violating principles of mathematics in ways that cause calculating machines to malfunction when attempting to process the data. The planet's surface changes color constantly, cycling through hues that exist outside the normal visible spectrum. Attempts to land survey teams have failed, with drop pods and landing craft experiencing navigation failures that send them to locations hundreds of kilometers from their intended landing zones, or worse, depositing them inside solid matter or in regions where gravity functions backwards. The presence of Khorne's influence manifests in systems where entire populations have been transformed into eternal warriors locked in battles that never end. Worlds claimed by the Blood God feature landscapes of brass and bone, with rivers running red with blood that never coagulates. The populations on these worlds exist in a state of constant warfare, fighting battles that rage for centuries without pause. Imperial observers monitoring these worlds report that the combatants never tire, never retreat, and never die permanently. Warriors cut down in battle rise again moments later, their wounds healing instantly so they can return to the slaughter. The violence generates psychic reverberations that ripple through the warp, attracting demons and chaos worshippers from across the region to join the endless conflict. Slaanesh's corruption appears more subtly in the Ghoul Stars, manifesting in systems where entire civilizations have been twisted by the pursuit of sensation and excess. These worlds maintain the appearance of functionality, with cities that still operate and populations that still engage in daily activities. Closer examination reveals the depth of their corruption. The inhabitants have modified themselves through surgery and genetic alteration in pursuit of new experiences, transforming their bodies into forms that blend human and demonic characteristics. Their cities contain structures dedicated to practices that would drive unprotected observers insane, temples where the boundaries between pleasure and pain have been erased. The populations of these worlds no longer recognize concepts like morality or restraint, having surrendered completely to the pursuit of sensation in all its forms. The Chaos Space Marine presence in the Ghoul Stars represents a significant military threat that the Death Specters and other Imperial forces struggle to counter effectively. The region's isolation and hostile environment make it an ideal refuge for traitor Legion warbands seeking to escape Imperial retribution. The same factors that limit Imperial military operations in the region work to the advantage of Chaos forces, who have adapted to the Ghoul Stars' unique conditions over millennia of operation. These warbands maintain hidden bases on corrupted worlds and in deep space facilities, emerging to conduct raids against Imperial targets before retreating into the darkness, where pursuit becomes impossible. Night Lords warbands operate extensively throughout the Ghoul Stars, finding the region's perpetual darkness ideally suited to their terror tactics. These Sons of Conrad Curs have established multiple bases in the region, using abandoned facilities from the Dark Age of technology as their fortresses. The Night Lords exploit the psychological impact of the Ghoul Stars' environment, combining the natural horror of the region with their own capacity for generating fear. They conduct raids that target isolated Imperial outposts and civilian populations, leaving survivors to spread tales of the atrocities they witnessed. The Death Specters have engaged Night Lords' forces on numerous occasions, with both sides demonstrating expertise in void warfare and boarding actions that results in brutal close-quarters combat where neither side asks or gives quarter. Evidence exists of other traitor Legion forces operating in the region, though confirming their presence proves difficult given the challenges of gathering intelligence in such hostile territory. Reports describe encounters with Chaos Space Marines wearing the colors of the Word Bearers, suggesting that Lorgar's sons maintain a presence in the Ghoul Stars for purposes related to their religious devotion to the ruinous powers. The region's high concentration of warp phenomena and demon worlds would naturally attract Word Bearers seeking to spread their dark faith. Other reports mention warriors in the black and gold of the Black Legion, indicating that Abaddon's forces recognize the strategic value of maintaining bases in a region where Imperial authority remains weak. The relationship between the Chaos Space Marine warbands and the region's other threats remains unclear. Some evidence suggests cooperation between traitor Legion forces and Xenos species like the Sither Fiends, though such alliances would represent unusual pragmatism for warriors dedicated to chaos. More commonly, the different factions appear to operate independently, pursuing their own objectives without coordination. This lack of unified command actually increases the threat level, as Imperial forces must prepare for multiple types of enemies that might appear simultaneously without warning. A Death Specter's patrol might engage a Night Lord's warband only to find themselves caught between the traitors and a Sither Fiend raiding party, forcing them to fight on multiple fronts against enemies employing completely different tactics. The fundamental question of whether the Ghoul Stars' darkness stems from natural astronomical phenomena or represents the influence of chaos has occupied Imperial scholars and Inquisitors for millennia. The region's dying stars and unusual stellar composition provide a mundane explanation for the perpetual twilight that characterizes most systems. The high concentration of neutron stars and other exotic stellar remnants creates gravitational and radiation effects that could account for many of the navigational hazards. Yet the sheer concentration of warp-related phenomena suggests something more than natural processes at work. The number of reality tiers, the frequency of warp storms, and the presence of multiple demon worlds all point to active corruption rather than simple bad luck. Some Ordo Malleus Inquisitors have proposed that the Ghoul Stars occupy a region where the barrier between real space and the warp has always been thinner than elsewhere in the galaxy. This natural weakness would make the area more susceptible to corruption, with warp storms and reality tears forming more easily than in regions where the dimensional barrier remains strong. The ancient Xeno civilizations that once inhabited the region might have recognized this weakness and either exploited it for their own purposes or fled when they realized the danger it represented. The human colonists who settled the region during the Dark Age of technology would have been unaware of this fundamental instability, building their civilization on foundations that were already compromised. Alternative theories suggest that something in the region actively works to weaken reality, deliberately creating conditions favorable to chaos corruption. These theories point to evidence of massive ritual sites discovered on several worlds, structures that appear designed to channel warp energy on a planetary scale. The purpose of these rituals remains unknown, but their effects would have been catastrophic, potentially creating the reality tears and permanent warp storms that now plague the region. Whether these rituals were conducted by the ancient Xenos inhabitants, by human colonists driven mad during the Age of Strife, or by chaos cultists in the millennia, since remains a matter of debate among those few scholars with access to the relevant data. The Death Specters maintain their own theories regarding the nature of the Ghoul Stars' corruption, though they share little of their conclusions with outside authorities. Their millennia of experience operating in the region has given them insights that other Imperial forces lack. Chapter records contain observations and data gathered over thousands of years, documenting patterns in warp storm behavior and mapping the locations of reality tears with precision that exceeds anything in Administratum archives. The Death Specters believe that the corruption in the Ghoul Stars follows patterns that suggest intelligence behind its spread, with new demon worlds appearing in locations that seem strategically chosen rather than random. This implies that something guides the corruption, directing it towards specific objectives that the chapter works to understand and counter. The Imperial archives contain records of over 200 major expeditions into the Ghoul Stars across the 10 millennia since the Emperor first unified Terra and launched humanity's reconquest of the galaxy. The term major in this context refers to organized military or exploratory operations involving multiple vessels and significant personnel commitments, as opposed to the countless individual ship transits and minor survey missions that have ventured into the region. Of these 200 expeditions, fewer than half returned with any personnel surviving to file reports. Of those that did return, the information they brought back often raised more questions than it answered, describing phenomena and threats that defied Imperial understanding of how the universe should function. The earliest comprehensive records date from the Great Crusade era, when the Emperor's forces first pushed into the galactic northeast and encountered the region's hostile conditions. These initial expeditions operated under assumptions that proved catastrophically incorrect, expecting to find either abandoned human colonies ready for reintegration or Xenos threats that could be eliminated through standard military doctrine. The expeditionary fleets consisted of hundreds of vessels carrying tens of thousands of Imperial Army personnel, supported by elements from several Space Marine legions, and accompanied by Mechanicus explorator teams eager to recover Dark Age technology. The commanders of these forces filed regular reports during the early stages of their operations, describing the discovery of dead worlds and abandoned facilities that showed signs of advanced human civilization. The reports grew increasingly disturbing as the expeditions penetrated deeper into the region. Fleet commanders described losing contact with individual vessels that simply vanished from formation without distress signals or any indication of what had happened to them. Survey teams landing on apparently dead worlds found themselves under attack by creatures that shouldn't exist according to Imperial xenobiological classifications. The Mechanicus contingents reported that ancient technology they attempted to study or activate behaved in ways that violated the principles of the Omnissiah, with machine spirits that appeared corrupted by forces the tech priests couldn't identify. The final transmissions from several of these early expeditions consisted of fragmentary distress calls describing threats that the senders lacked the vocabulary to properly explain, speaking of darkness that moved with purpose and intelligence that watched from the spaces between stars. One expedition from the early 31st millennium, designated Crusade Fleet 217, provides a representative example of the pattern these operations followed. The fleet consisted of 87 vessels, including 3 battleships, 20 cruisers, and numerous escorts and support craft. They carried a full army corps of 200,000 personnel, along with significant Mechanicus support, and a company strength detachment from what records indicate was the Raven Guard Legion. The fleet's objective involved surveying a cluster of systems in the region's interior that Augur scans suggested contained multiple habitable worlds with signs of human habitation. The expedition maintained regular astropathic contact for the first 6 months of operations, transmitting survey data and status reports that indicated steady progress despite encountering some of the navigational difficulties typical of the region. The astropathic messages began arriving corrupted after the 7th month, with the receiving stations on the expedition's forward bases reporting that transmissions contained interference that made portions of the messages unintelligible. What information did come through described the fleet discovering a system containing 7 planets, all of which showed evidence of human settlement during the Dark Age of technology. The expedition's commander reported finding cities that appeared intact, with power still flowing through their infrastructure despite thousands of years of abandonment. Landing parties sent to investigate these cities transmitted initial reports describing structures that followed no recognizable architectural pattern, with buildings that seemed to occupy more space internally than their external dimensions should allow. The final coherent transmission from Crusade Fleet 217 arrived as a fragmented astropathic message that the receiving astropaths described as causing them physical pain to receive. The message spoke of the fleet coming under attack from vessels that appeared human in origin, but showed modifications that served no logical purpose. The attacking ships incorporated organic components into their hulls and demonstrated capabilities that exceeded anything in the Imperial arsenal. The fleet commander reported that boarding parties from these vessels consisted of creatures wearing Imperial army uniforms, but possessing anatomies that were fundamentally wrong. The transmission ended abruptly, and all subsequent attempts to contact the fleet received only silence. A recovery expedition sent 5 years later found no trace of Crusade Fleet 217, their 87 vessels having vanished completely, along with the 200,000 personnel aboard them. The Administratum maintains detailed records of similar losses throughout the millennia following the Great Crusade. Each century sees multiple expeditions disappear into the Ghoul Stars, their fates unknown but presumed catastrophic. The pattern remains consistent across the ages. Expeditions maintain contact during their initial operations, report increasingly strange phenomena as they penetrate deeper into the region, then cease all communication after transmitting fragmentary warnings about threats they cannot adequately describe. The cumulative loss of personnel and materiel represents a significant drain on Imperial resources, yet the expeditions continue because the potential rewards of recovering Dark Age technology or securing strategic positions in the region justify the risks in the eyes of Imperial command. Some expeditions do return, though the survivors often bring information that proves as disturbing as the complete loss of those that vanish. A Navy patrol that entered the Ghoul Stars in the 35th millennium returned after 3 years of operations, with only 2 of their original 12 vessels intact. The crews reported encountering a derelict space station of human construction that appeared to be actively growing, its structure expanding through processes that resembled biological growth rather than mechanical construction. Investigation teams that boarded the station found it contained thousands of stasis pods, each holding a human in perfect preservation. The pods bore no identification markings and showed no signs of age despite appearing to have been active for millennia. When the Navy crews attempted to revive some of the occupants, the individuals emerged speaking languages that linguistic analysis suggested predated the age of strife by thousands of years. More disturbing still, these revived individuals possessed knowledge of stellar engineering and warp mechanics that exceeded anything in Imperial understanding, yet they claimed to be simple colonists with no specialized training. The Inquisition maintains its own archives regarding the Ghoul Stars, classified at levels that restrict access to all but the most senior inquisitors and their chosen staff. These records contain information deemed too dangerous for general distribution, including detailed accounts of expeditions that encountered evidence of active chaos corruption or Xenos threats that posed risks beyond simple military danger. The Ordo Xenos maintains extensive files on the Scyther fiends and other hostile species in the region, compiling data from every encounter Imperial forces have survived. These files include biological samples, behavioral analysis, and tactical assessments that inform Imperial strategy for dealing with these threats. The documentation reveals that the fiends represent only the most visible of numerous Xenos species operating in the region, with dozens of other hostile organisms cataloged based on fragmentary evidence from brief encounters. The Ordo Malleus files on the Ghoul Stars contain warnings that date back to the earliest days of the Inquisition's founding. These warnings describe the region as a zone of active warp corruption, where the barrier between real space and the Imperium has degraded to dangerous levels. Inquisitors who specialize in studying demonic threats have compiled evidence suggesting that multiple demon worlds exist within the Ghoul Stars, serving as staging grounds for incursions into surrounding Imperial territory. The Malleus maintains constant vigil over the region's boundaries, watching for signs that the corruption might be spreading beyond its current containment. Several Inquisitor lords have proposed launching major military operations to cleanse the demon worlds, but the logistical challenges and the risk of losing entire Crusade fleets to the region's hazards have prevented these proposals from advancing beyond the planning stage. Recovered data cores from ships lost in the Ghoul Stars provide fragmentary glimpses into what these vessels encountered before their destruction or disappearance. The Mechanicus maintains specialized facilities for analyzing these data cores, using techniques that extract information from damaged storage media that conventional methods would declare completely corrupted. The data retrieved through these processes rarely provides complete pictures of what happened, but patterns emerge when information from multiple sources is compiled and analyzed. Ships report encountering vessels that match descriptions from other incidents separated by centuries or even millennia, suggesting that certain threats persist in the region across vast spans of time. Multiple data cores contain references to massive structures in deep space that appear on no Imperial charts, installations of such scale that they dwarf even the largest Imperial void stations. One particularly disturbing pattern involves references to coordinated behavior among threats that should have no capacity for cooperation. Data cores from Navy vessels attacked by Xenos forces describe situations where multiple distinct species appeared to be working together, their actions synchronized in ways that suggested communication and planning. A cruiser lost in the 38th millennium transmitted logs describing an engagement where Scyther fiends and what appeared to be corrupted human vessels attacked simultaneously from different vectors. Their assault coordinated with precision that indicated shared intelligence about the Imperial ship's capabilities and weaknesses. Similar accounts appear in records from other centuries, always describing situations where threats that should be acting independently instead demonstrate coordination that implies some form of overarching control or shared purpose. The ship logs also contain references to astronomical phenomena that defy Imperial understanding of stellar mechanics. Multiple vessels report observing stars that move from their charted positions, shifting through space in ways that natural stellar motion cannot account for. Other logs describe watching stars die at accelerated rates, their fusion processes somehow disrupted by forces that operate outside normal physics. One Navy captain filed a report describing his vessel's observation of a star that appeared to be deliberately murdered, its light consumed by something vast that emerged from the darkness between systems. The captain's description of this entity defied coherent explanation, speaking of shadows that possessed mass and intelligence that existed in the spaces where light could not reach. Forbidden texts maintained in the deepest vaults of the Inquisition and the Administratum contain references to the Ghoul Stars that suggest knowledge of the region's dangers predates the Imperium itself. These manuscripts, many of which bear proscription marks indicating that their mere possession constitutes heresy, describe the region using terminology that implies the authors understood its true nature. One text recovered from a world brought into Imperial compliance during the Great Crusade speaks of the harrowing, a term that appears to reference some catastrophic event that transformed the region from thriving human territory into the nightmare it has become. The text describes this harrowing as deliberate rather than natural, the result of actions taken by intelligences that sought to create a region where the normal laws of reality would no longer apply. Another manuscript, this one found in the personal library of a planetary governor who was later executed for heresy, contains star charts that show the Ghoul Stars region as it appeared before the Age of Strife. These charts depict systems filled with thriving human colonies, their stars burning bright and steady. Notations on the charts reference stellar engineering projects of staggering ambition, including artificial wormhole networks and stellar manipulation on scales that exceed anything attempted during the Dark Age of technology. The manuscript includes warnings written in archaic High Gothic, stating that these projects attracted attention from forces that existed beyond human understanding, entities that dwelt in the darkness between galaxies and fed on the light of stars. The most disturbing of these forbidden texts consists of a journal recovered from the wreckage of an explorator vessel that disappeared into the Ghoul Stars during the 33rd millennium. The journal belonged to a Magos who had been studying the region's stellar phenomena, attempting to develop a unified theory that would explain the unusual behavior of stars in the area. The entries begin as standard scientific observations, documenting measurements and developing hypotheses based on established principles of astrophysics. As the expedition penetrated deeper into the region, the entries become increasingly erratic, with the Magos describing observations that violated everything he understood about how stars function. The final entries abandon all pretense of scientific objectivity, instead describing the Magos' growing conviction that the stars themselves were alive in some fashion, that they possessed awareness and communicated with each other through means that human instruments could barely detect. The patterns that emerge from compiling all available information about the Ghoul Stars suggest a level of coordinated threat that exceeds what random hazards or unconnected hostile forces could produce. The region's various dangers appear to reinforce each other, creating a layered defense that makes penetration increasingly difficult the deeper one ventures into the interior systems. The warp storms and reality tears limit safe navigation routes, channeling ships along predictable paths where Xenos raiders or chaos forces can ambush them. The hostile stellar phenomena drain ship resources and strain equipment, weakening vessels before they encounter direct military threats. The psychological pressure that builds from operating in perpetual darkness and isolation degrades crew effectiveness, making them more vulnerable when combat does occur. Several Inquisitors who have made the Ghoul Stars their life's work have developed theories proposing that something actively maintains the region's hostile conditions. These theories suggest that an intelligence of vast scope and patience has shaped the Ghoul Stars into a trap, using the region's natural hazards as raw material to construct a maze designed to lure in and destroy Imperial forces. The purpose behind such an effort remains unclear, though proposals range from simple defense of whatever lies at the region's heart to more sinister objectives involving the corruption and transformation of Imperial personnel who venture too deep. The evidence supporting these theories remains circumstantial, consisting of patterns that might indicate design, but could equally represent coincidence or the human tendency to perceive intention in random events. The Death Specters maintain their own archives regarding expeditions into the Ghoul Stars, compiled over their millennia of service as the region's primary Imperial guardians. These records contain information that the chapter has never shared with outside authorities, including detailed maps of the region's interior systems and intelligence regarding threats that other Imperial forces have never encountered. The chapter's librarians have developed techniques for analyzing the fragmentary information that survivors bring back from deep penetrations, using their psychic abilities to extract memories that the conscious mind has suppressed due to trauma. This process reveals details about the region that appear in no written reports, knowledge of places and entities that exist beyond the reach of conventional Imperial expeditions. The chapter has identified what they believe to be central hubs within the Ghoul Stars, systems that appear to serve as coordination points for the region's various threats. These systems show unusual levels of activity, with multiple hostile forces operating in close proximity without the conflicts that would normally occur when different factions occupy the same territory. The Death Specters have attempted to investigate these hub systems on several occasions, but each expedition has been forced to withdraw before gathering conclusive intelligence. The defenses surrounding these systems exceed anything encountered elsewhere in the region, suggesting that whatever controls or coordinates the threats considers these locations vital enough to warrant exceptional protection. The accumulated knowledge regarding the Ghoul Stars paints a picture of a region that poses existential threats to the Imperium on multiple levels. The military danger from Xenos species, like the Sither Fiends and Chaos forces operating from demon worlds, represents an immediate concern that requires constant vigilance to contain. The warp corruption that pervades the region threatens to spread beyond current boundaries, potentially creating new demon worlds in systems that currently remain under Imperial control. The ancient technology scattered throughout abandoned facilities offers rewards that could significantly enhance Imperial capabilities, but accessing this technology requires accepting risks that have destroyed every large-scale expedition that has attempted to do so. The fundamental question of what lies at the heart of the Ghoul Stars, what purpose the region serves, and what intelligence might guide its hostile nature, remains unanswered despite millennia of investigation and the sacrifice of hundreds of thousands of Imperial personnel who ventured into the darkness and never returned. The historical record of military engagements in the Ghoul Stars stretches back to the earliest days of Imperial expansion into the region, with conflicts that have claimed millions of lives and hundreds of vessels across 10,000 years of warfare. These battles differ fundamentally from standard Imperial military operations in their unpredictability and the diverse nature of threats encountered. Where most Imperial campaigns involve clearly defined enemies and objectives, conflicts in the Ghoul Stars frequently pit Imperial forces against multiple hostile factions simultaneously, with the region's environmental hazards serving as an additional combatant that kills without discrimination. The first major recorded incursion from the Ghoul Stars into Imperial-controlled territory occurred in the 32nd millennium, approximately 3 centuries after the Horus Heresy had shattered the Imperium's unity. A massive Xenos fleet emerged from the region's depths, consisting of vessels that bore no resemblance to any known alien ship classification. Imperial Navy reconnaissance detected the fleet as it crossed the boundary between the Ghoul Stars and the surrounding sectors, their augur returns showing over 200 vessels of varying sizes moving in coordinated formation. The fleet bypassed several lightly defended systems, suggesting their commanders possessed detailed intelligence about Imperial defensive deployments. Their target became clear when they struck at the Forge world of Gans Prime, a Mechanicus installation that produced plasma weapons and maintained extensive research facilities studying exotic stellar phenomena. The attack on Gans Prime demonstrated tactical sophistication that caught Imperial defenders completely unprepared. The Xenos fleet translated from the warp at multiple points around the planet simultaneously, their arrival coordinated with precision that suggested either superior navigation technology or some form of collective consciousness that allowed instant communication across vast distances. The initial bombardment targeted the planet's orbital defense platforms with weapons that bypassed void shields through means Imperial tech priests could not immediately identify. The defensive stations simply ceased functioning, their systems shutting down as if their machine spirits had been killed rather than their physical structures damaged. With the orbital defenses neutralized, the Xenos forces deployed landing craft that descended on the Forge world's primary manufacturing complexes. The Mechanicus defenders fought with the determination expected of the Omnissiah's servants, deploying Skitarii legions and battle automata to contest every meter of their sacred facilities. The Xenos warriors they faced possessed biological characteristics that identified them as Scyther fiends, though these specimens displayed variations from the creatures encountered in earlier conflicts. Some stood nearly 4 meters tall, their exoskeletons reinforced with metallic plating that appeared to be grown rather than attached. Others moved with inhuman speed, their limbs modified into blade-like appendages that cut through Skitarii armor with ease. The fiends employed weapons that fired projectiles which burrowed into their targets before detonating, turning armored warriors into clouds of gore and shrapnel that wounded nearby defenders. The battle for Gantz Prime lasted 17 days before Imperial reinforcements arrived in sufficient strength to drive off the Xenos' attackers. By that time, the Fiends had captured over 30,000 Mechanicus personnel, including several high-ranking Magi whose knowledge of plasma technology and stellar research represented irreplaceable losses. The Xenos withdrew in good order, their fleet departing the system before the Imperial Navy could bring its full strength to bear. Analysis of the attack revealed that the Fiends had specifically targeted research facilities studying the Ghoul Stars, suggesting they sought to eliminate Imperial efforts to understand the region. The captured personnel were never recovered, their fate unknown, but presumably serving as hosts for Fiend reproduction or subjects for whatever experiments the Xenos conducted in their hidden bases. The Gantz Prime raid established a pattern that would repeat across subsequent centuries. Every few decades, major Xenos incursions emerged from the Ghoul Stars, striking at Imperial systems with precision that indicated detailed reconnaissance and planning. These attacks targeted worlds of strategic importance rather than random frontier settlements, focusing on Forge worlds, naval bases, and systems that served as major trade hubs. The raiders demonstrated knowledge of Imperial defensive capabilities and deployment schedules that suggested either sophisticated intelligence networks or the ability to observe Imperial activities from within the Ghoul Stars themselves. Each incursion followed similar tactical patterns, coordinated strikes that overwhelmed local defenses through speed and surprise, capture of large numbers of prisoners, then rapid withdrawal before Imperial reinforcements could arrive. The Death Spectre's chapter bore the primary responsibility for responding to these incursions, their mandate as guardians of the region requiring them to intercept threats before they could penetrate deep into Imperial space. The chapter maintained constant patrols along the border between the Ghoul Stars and surrounding sectors, their vessels positioned to respond quickly to any detected Xenos activity. This defensive posture resulted in numerous engagements where Death Spectre's forces intercepted raiding fleets attempting to transit through monitored space. These battles occurred in the void between stars, with neither side able to call on planetary support or reinforcements within reasonable timeframes. One such engagement in the 34th millennium demonstrated both the Death Spectre's tactical capabilities and the challenges they faced in combating threats from the Ghoul Stars. A chapter strike force consisting of 3 cruisers and supporting escorts detected a Xenos fleet attempting to bypass their patrol route through a region of space where warp currents created navigational hazards that most Imperial vessels avoided. The Death Spectre's commander recognized the tactical opportunity, positioning his vessels to intercept the Xenos fleet as it emerged from the warp at the edge of the hazard zone. The resulting battle lasted 6 hours, with both sides maneuvering through a region where gravitational anomalies from nearby neutron stars created fields that could crush vessels that ventured too close. The Xenos fleet consisted of vessels that matched descriptions of Sith or Fiend ships from previous encounters, their hulls incorporating organic components that pulsed with bioluminescence in the darkness of deep space. The Death Spectres engaged at extreme range, their weapons batteries targeting the Xenos vessels with precision fire that exploited weaknesses identified in previous battles. The Fiends responded with weapons that fired projectiles, which accelerated to relativistic speeds, turning each shot into a kinetic impact that could penetrate multiple decks of Imperial armor. The Death Spectres' centuries of experience fighting in the Ghoul Stars proved decisive, their commanders predicting Xenos tactics and positioning their vessels to minimize exposure to the most dangerous weapons while maximizing their own firing solutions. The battle concluded when Death Spectres' boarding parties successfully breached the Xenos flagship, fighting through corridors that twisted at angles that made movement difficult and disorienting. The Space Marines encountered Fiend warriors that had been specifically adapted for shipboard combat, their bodies compressed to fit through narrow passages, while maintaining the strength to tear through power armor with their claws. The boarding action reached its climax when the Death Spectres reached the vessel's central control chamber, a space filled with organic growths that appeared to serve as both navigation systems and weapons control. The destruction of these organic systems caused catastrophic failures throughout the Xenos fleet, with multiple vessels losing power and drifting helplessly. The surviving Xenos vessels retreated into the warp, abandoning their disabled comrades to Imperial capture. The captured vessels provided intelligence that proved both valuable and disturbing. Examination of the organic control systems revealed biological structures that incorporated human genetic material, suggesting the Fiends had been experimenting with incorporating captured prisoners into their technology. The ship's holds contained stasis pods holding thousands of humans in various stages of transformation, their bodies showing signs of genetic modification that blurred the line between human and Xenos. Mechanicus xenobiologists studying these victims concluded that the Fiends possessed sophisticated understanding of human biology, using their captives not just as hosts for reproduction, but as raw material for creating hybrid organisms that served specific purposes within their society. The Death Spectres' offensive operations into the Ghoul Stars themselves represented some of the most dangerous missions the chapter undertook. These expeditions ventured beyond the defensive perimeter the chapter normally maintained, penetrating deep into Xenos' controlled territory to strike at identified threat concentrations before they could organize major incursions. The chapter planned these operations meticulously, gathering intelligence through long-range reconnaissance and analysis of captured Xenos vessels. Each expedition consisted of multiple strike forces operating independently, their movements coordinated to hit several targets simultaneously and prevent the Xenos from concentrating their forces against any single Imperial thrust. A major offensive launched in the 37th millennium targeted a system the Death Spectres had identified as a major Sith or Fiend staging area. Intelligence suggested the system contained multiple worlds where the Fiends maintained breeding facilities and constructed the vessels used in their raids. The chapter committed nearly half its combat strength to the operation, deploying 6 companies supported by the majority of its fleet assets. The expedition translated from the warp at the system's edge, their arrival timed to coincide with periods when augur readings suggested minimal Xenos fleet presence. The Death Spectres found instead that they had walked into a trap, with Xenos forces far exceeding intelligence estimates waiting in ambush. The ensuing battle tested the Death Spectres' capabilities to their limits. The Xenos fleet outnumbered the chapter's forces by a ratio of 3-to-1, their vessels emerging from positions hidden behind the system's outer planets where Imperial augurs had failed to detect them. The Death Spectres found themselves fighting a defensive action while attempting to withdraw to safe warp translation distance, their vessels taking severe damage from Xenos weapons that targeted their engines and warp drives. 3 chapter cruisers suffered critical damage that left them unable to translate, forcing the Death Spectres to make the difficult decision to scuttle these vessels rather than allow them to fall into Xenos' hands. The chapter's battle barge managed to hold the line long enough for the remaining vessels to escape, its armor scarred by impacts that had penetrated deep into its superstructure. The failed offensive cost the Death Spectres over 200 battle brothers and 3 irreplaceable capital ships. The chapter's leadership drew harsh lessons from the engagement, recognizing that the Xenos possessed intelligence capabilities that allowed them to predict Imperial operations with disturbing accuracy. Subsequent operations placed greater emphasis on deception and operational security, with the Death Spectres developing protocols that limited the number of personnel who knew complete mission details until forces had already translated into target systems. These measures reduced the effectiveness of whatever intelligence networks the Xenos maintained, though they could not eliminate the threat entirely. The Imperial Navy's involvement in the Ghoul Stars consisted primarily of patrol operations along the region's borders and escort duties for the few authorized commercial vessels that transited through the outer systems. Navy doctrine designated the region as a restricted operations zone, with standing orders that prohibited standard patrol vessels from venturing beyond carefully mapped safe routes. These restrictions reflected hard-won experience from incidents where Navy vessels that strayed from approved transit lanes simply vanished, their fates unknown, but presumed lost to the region's numerous hazards. The Navy maintained permanent patrol stations at key points along the border, these facilities serving as both early warning posts and staging areas for response forces. One such patrol station, designated Watch Station Gamma 9, maintained surveillance over a region where multiple warp routes from the Ghoul Stars converged. The station's auger arrays monitored a volume of space encompassing dozens of cubic light years, their sensors calibrated to detect the specific energy signatures associated with vessels translating from the warp. In the 39th millennium, the station detected unusual activity that suggested a major fleet movement preparing to emerge from the Ghoul Stars. The auger readings showed energy buildups at multiple points, indicating that whatever was coming would arrive in significant strength. The station commander transmitted warning messages to Sector Command and activated protocols that brought nearby Navy assets to high alert. The fleet that emerged exceeded the worst-case scenarios Imperial planners had prepared for. Over 300 vessels translated from the warp across a front spanning light years, their arrival coordinated with precision that suggested either sophisticated navigation technology or preternatural awareness of warp currents. The vessels matched no known classification in Imperial or Xenos databases, their hulls incorporating design elements that appeared both organic and mechanical. They moved with purpose toward the nearest inhabited Imperial systems, their course suggesting they intended to bypass Watch Station Gamma 9 and strike directly at more valuable targets deeper in Imperial space. The Navy forces available to respond consisted of a squadron of cruisers and supporting escorts, woefully inadequate against a fleet of such size. The squadron commander made the decision to engage anyway, recognizing that allowing such a force to penetrate Imperial space unopposed would result in catastrophic losses. The Navy vessels positioned themselves across the Xenos fleet's projected course, their weapons batteries prepared to inflict maximum damage before the inevitable conclusion. The engagement began at extreme range, with Imperial Lance batteries targeting the largest Xenos vessels in an attempt to cripple their command structure. The Xenos responded with weapons that fired beams of energy that appeared to age whatever they struck, Imperial armor plating corroding and crumbling, as if exposed to centuries of decay in seconds. The battle lasted only 40 minutes before Death Spectre's reinforcements arrived, their fleet having received the warning from Watch Station Gamma 9 and rushed to intercept. The Space Marine vessels struck at the Xenos fleet's flanks, their boarding torpedoes targeting the largest enemy vessels, while their weapons batteries provided covering fire for the battered Navy squadron. The Death Spectre's arrival shifted the tactical situation, forcing the Xenos fleet to divide its attention between multiple threats. The Xenos commanders demonstrated tactical flexibility, detaching portions of their fleet to engage the Space Marines, while the main body continued toward their original objectives. This decision proved costly, as the Death Spectres systematically crippled the detached vessels, their superior training and equipment overcoming the numerical disadvantage. Additional Imperial reinforcements continued arriving over the following hours as Sector Command mobilized every available asset to counter the incursion. Navy battleships translated from the warp, alongside Adeptus Mechanicus vessels, and even several companies from other Space Marine chapters that happened to be operating in nearby sectors. The combined Imperial force eventually numbered over 100 vessels, sufficient to match the Xenos fleet in strength if not numbers. The battle evolved into a running engagement that stretched across multiple systems, with both sides maneuvering for advantage while exchanging fire at ranges that pushed Imperial weapons to their maximum effective distance. The Xenos fleet demonstrated capabilities that troubled Imperial observers. Their vessels accelerated and decelerated at rates that should have been impossible given their apparent mass, suggesting either gravity manipulation technology or engines that operated on principles Imperial physics could not explain. They coordinated their movements with precision that indicated either a unified command structure or some form of shared consciousness linking individual ships. When Imperial forces destroyed Xenos vessels, the wreckage behaved strangely, with debris that appeared to dissolve rather than simply breaking apart. Mechanicus analysis teams that examined recovered fragments found materials that registered as partially existing outside normal spacetime, their atomic structure shifting between different states in ways that violated conservation of mass. The engagement concluded when the Xenos fleet suddenly withdrew, their vessels translating into the warp simultaneously despite being scattered across multiple systems. The abrupt departure suggested either the achievement of whatever objective had motivated the incursion or response to some threat or opportunity that Imperial forces could not detect. The Navy and Death Spectres pursued, but the Xenos had vanished into the Ghoul Stars' depths, their warp signatures dissipating in the region's turbulent immaterium currents. Imperial losses from the engagement totaled 23 vessels destroyed and 47 damaged severely enough to require extensive repairs. Casualty figures exceeded 30,000 naval personnel and over 100 Space Marines from various chapters, though the Death Spectres bore the heaviest losses, with 63 battle brothers killed. The investigation following the incursion revealed disturbing patterns in how the Xenos fleet had operated. Analysis of engagement data showed that the enemy had possessed detailed knowledge of Imperial force dispositions and response capabilities. They had avoided systems where Imperial strength was concentrated while targeting areas where defenses were minimal. Their withdrawal had occurred precisely when Imperial reinforcements reached the threshold where continued engagement would result in unacceptable Xenos losses. This suggested intelligence gathering capabilities that penetrated deep into Imperial command structures, raising questions about how the Xenos obtained such information and what other secrets they might have compromised. Throughout the millennia, the Death Spectres documented numerous encounters with threats that defied classification or explanation. Their archives contained reports of battles against vessels that appeared human in origin, but showed modifications that served no purpose recognizable to Imperial observers. These ships incorporated organic growths into their hulls, with structures that pulsed and moved as if alive. The crews aboard these vessels, when captured, proved to be humans who had undergone extensive biological modification. Their bodies showed signs of genetic engineering that incorporated Xenos DNA sequences, creating hybrid organisms that retained human intelligence while gaining capabilities that exceeded baseline human limitations. Interrogation of these prisoners proved difficult as their minds had been altered along with their bodies, their thought patterns no longer following human logic. The Death Spectres also recorded encounters with what appeared to be automated defense systems left behind by the region's ancient inhabitants. These systems activated when Imperial vessels approached certain worlds or structures, deploying weapons platforms that emerged from the void to attack intruders. The platforms utilized technology that Imperial forces struggled to counter, firing weapons that manipulated gravity to crush ships or beams that caused matter to undergo rapid phase transitions from solid to plasma. The platforms demonstrated tactical awareness that exceeded simple automated responses, adapting their tactics based on Imperial countermeasures and focusing fire on vessels that pose the greatest threats. Attempts to capture intact platforms for study invariably resulted in the devices self-destructing, leaving only scattered debris that provided minimal intelligence value. The pattern of conflicts in the Ghoul Stars revealed a region where multiple threats coexisted and sometimes cooperated in ways that suggested coordination beyond what random chance could produce. The Death Specters documented instances where Xenos raiders and what appeared to be chaos-corrupted vessels attacked Imperial forces simultaneously, their assaults coordinated to exploit weaknesses in Imperial defensive formations. Whether this coordination represented deliberate alliance or simply opportunistic exploitation of favorable circumstances remained unclear, though the frequency of such occurrences suggested something more than coincidence. The chapter's leadership developed theories proposing that some intelligence within the Ghoul Stars directed or influenced the various threats, guiding them toward objectives that served purposes the Imperium could not fully comprehend. The opening of the Great Rift fundamentally altered the strategic situation throughout the galaxy, and the Ghoul Stars experienced changes that defied even the region's already abnormal standards. The Cicatrix Maledictum tore reality apart across vast stretches of space, creating a permanent wound in the galaxy that separated the Imperium into two distinct halves. The massive warp storm extended tendrils in multiple directions, with one such tendril reaching toward the galactic northeast, where the Ghoul Stars had festered for millennia. Imperial astrocartographers tracking the rift's expansion watched with growing concern as the storm approached the region's boundaries, uncertain what effect the meeting of two zones of extreme warp corruption would produce. The Death Specters maintained observation posts, positioned to monitor any changes in the region's behavior following the Great Rift's formation. Their auger stations detected massive fluctuations in local warp currents as the Cicatrix Maledictum's influence reached the Ghoul Stars. The existing warp storms that had plagued the region for thousands of years began behaving erratically, some intensifying to levels that exceeded anything in recorded observations, while others dissipated entirely without explanation. New tiers in reality opened across multiple systems, their formation following patterns that suggested response to the Great Rift's presence rather than random occurrence. The Death Specters transmitted reports to their command structure, describing a region that appeared to be reacting to the galaxy-spanning catastrophe, though whether this reaction represented simple physical response to increased warp turbulence or something more deliberate remained unclear. The relationship between the Great Rift and the Ghoul Stars proved more complex than simple proximity would suggest. Rather than merging into a single unified zone of corruption, the two regions maintained distinct characteristics, while influencing each other in ways that Imperial observers struggled to predict. The Cicatrix Maledictum created a zone of warp storms that made travel between the Imperium's two halves nearly impossible through conventional means, but the Ghoul Stars had always operated under different rules. The region's warp routes, treacherous as they were, continued functioning despite the Great Rift's presence. Ships that could navigate the Ghoul Stars' unique conditions found they could potentially use the region as a backdoor route between Imperium Sanctus and Imperium Nihilus, bypassing the Cicatrix Maledictum's impassable barriers. This possibility attracted attention from multiple Imperial factions desperate to maintain contact across the Great Rift's divide. Rogue traders who had avoided the Ghoul Stars for generations began petitioning for authorization to attempt transit through the region, arguing that the potential benefits justified the extreme risks. The Administratum received proposals for establishing permanent way stations along routes through the Ghoul Stars, creating infrastructure that would support regular traffic between the Imperium's severed halves. The Death Specters opposed these proposals with unusual vehemence, their chapter master personally appearing before high-ranking Imperial officials to argue against any expansion of activity in the region. The chapter's position emphasized that the Ghoul Stars had become more dangerous following the Great Rift's formation, not less, and that increased traffic would result in catastrophic losses. The Death Specter's concerns proved well-founded as evidence accumulated of heightened threat activity throughout the region. Xenos raids into Imperial space increased in both frequency and scale, with Sither Fiend incursions occurring every few months rather than the previous pattern of attacks separated by years or decades. The raiders demonstrated enhanced capabilities that suggested either technological advancement or increased access to resources. Their vessels incorporated new weapon systems that Imperial forces had not encountered in previous engagements, including devices that projected fields causing rapid entropy in whatever they touched. Imperial ships struck by these weapons experienced catastrophic systems failures as their components aged centuries in seconds, their hulls corroding and their engines seizing as lubricants evaporated and metal fatigued beyond tolerance. The Fiends also displayed new tactical behaviors that indicated either evolution in their strategic thinking or direction from some higher intelligence. Their raids targeted specific Imperial facilities with precision that suggested detailed reconnaissance, focusing on sites that held strategic value rather than simply attacking targets of opportunity. A particularly devastating raid in the early 42nd millennium struck at a Navy depot that served as a major logistics hub for forces operating near the Ghoul Stars. The Xenos forces bypassed multiple defensive installations to reach the depot, their approach route threading through spatial anomalies that Imperial vessels avoided due to navigational hazards. The attack destroyed supply stockpiles that represented months of accumulated materiel, forcing the Navy to curtail operations in the region, while replacement supplies were transported from distant Forge worlds. The Death Specters responded to the increased threat level by expanding their operational tempo beyond sustainable levels. The chapter maintained constant patrols across a frontier that stretched across dozens of systems, their vessels pushing their machine spirits to limits that risked permanent damage. Battle Brothers spent years aboard ship without returning to Occludus, their power armor showing where that would normally trigger mandatory maintenance cycles. The chapter's Tech Marines worked continuously to keep equipment functional, performing repairs in the field that would normally require Forge World facilities. This operational strain began affecting the chapter's combat effectiveness, with companies reporting equipment failures during critical engagements and Battle Brothers suffering injuries that could have been prevented with proper rest and recovery time. The Indomitus Crusades launch provided the Death Specters with desperately needed reinforcements in the form of Primaris Space Marines. These new Battle Brothers arrived bearing equipment that represented the most advanced technology the Imperium could produce, their Mark X power armor incorporating systems that exceeded anything the chapter's existing arsenal possessed. The Primaris Marines brought with them new vehicle patterns and weapons that promised to enhance the chapter's capabilities significantly. However, integrating these reinforcements into the Death Specter's existing structure presented challenges that went beyond simple logistics and training. The Primaris Marines assigned to the Death Specters came from the same gene seed lineage as the chapter's existing Battle Brothers, carrying the genetic legacy of their Primarch in enhanced form. Yet they lacked the decades of experience operating in the Ghoul Stars that define the chapter's traditional approach to warfare. The new arrivals had trained in environments that followed predictable physical laws, where darkness meant simply the absence of light rather than an active threat that moved with purpose. Their tactical doctrine emphasized the aggressive shock assault tactics that Primaris forces employed across the galaxy, approaches that worked well in conventional warfare but required significant modification for the unique conditions in the Ghoul Stars. The Death Specter's veteran sergeants took responsibility for training the Primaris reinforcements in the specialized skills required for operations in the region. The new Marines learned to fight in conditions of absolute darkness, where their armor's visual systems provided no useful input, relying instead on audio sensors and motion detectors to track enemies. They practiced boarding actions against mock-ups of Xenos vessels, where corridors twisted at angles that defied spatial logic and gravity shifted unpredictably. The training claimed lives as Primaris Marines made mistakes that veterans had learned to avoid through hard experience, their enhanced physiology proving insufficient protection against threats that operated outside normal physical parameters. Combat operations provided the ultimate test of the Primaris Marines' adaptation to their new environment. A strike force consisting of both traditional and Primaris battle brothers engaged a Sither fiend raiding party attempting to penetrate Imperial space through a poorly monitored warp route. The engagement began in deep space, with the Death Spectre's vessels intercepting the Xenos fleet as it emerged from the warp. The Primaris Marines deployed via boarding torpedoes, their Inceptor squads using jump packs to cross the void between ships, while heavy weapons teams provided suppressing fire. The assault succeeded in breaching multiple Xenos vessels, with Primaris squads fighting through corridors where the Fiends had prepared defensive positions. The Primaris Marines' enhanced strength and durability proved advantageous in close combat against Fiend warriors whose claws could penetrate standard power armor. Their bolt rifles delivered higher rates of fire than traditional bolters, allowing them to suppress Xenos positions more effectively. However, the new arrivals also made tactical errors that veterans avoided, their aggressive assault doctrine leading them into ambush situations where the Fiends' superior knowledge of their own ship layouts gave them decisive advantages. Several Primaris squads suffered heavy casualties when they pushed too far ahead of supporting elements, finding themselves surrounded by Fiends that had infiltrated through passages the Marines hadn't known existed. The engagement concluded with the Death Spectres destroying 3 Xenos vessels and forcing the remainder to retreat, but the cost included the loss of 23 Primaris Marines and 8 traditional battle brothers. The after-action analysis revealed that most Primaris casualties resulted from tactical decisions that failed to account for the unique nature of combat in the Ghoul Stars. The chapter's leadership recognized that fully integrating the Primaris reinforcements would require time and continued exposure to the region's specific challenges, with casualties representing an inevitable cost of that learning process. Reports from Primaris Marines, who survived extended operations in the Ghoul Stars, described experiences that challenged their understanding of warfare and reality itself. These battle brothers had trained to face the Imperium's enemies with confidence in their enhanced capabilities, yet they found themselves confronting threats that their superior physiology could not simply overcome through strength or endurance. The psychological pressure that veteran Death Spectres had learned to manage through decades of exposure affected Primaris Marines with unexpected severity, their enhanced neurological systems providing no protection against the sensation of being watched by vast intelligences that existed beyond normal perception. One Primaris sergeant filed a report describing an engagement where his squad boarded a derelict vessel drifting in deep space, responding to what appeared to be an automated distress beacon. The ship's interior showed signs of human habitation, with personal effects and equipment that matched Imperial patterns from several centuries prior. The squad discovered the crew in the vessel's central compartment, their bodies preserved by the cold of space, but showing no signs of violence or obvious cause of death. As the Primaris Marines investigated, they began experiencing sensory distortions, where their armor systems registered readings that contradicted what their enhanced senses perceived. The sergeant reported seeing movement in shadows that shouldn't exist in the ship's zero-gravity environment, hearing sounds that propagated through vacuum where no medium existed for sound transmission. The situation deteriorated when the dead crew members began moving, their preserved corpses animated by something that the Primaris Marines' training had not prepared them to face. The reanimated bodies moved with coordination that suggested intelligence directing their actions, attacking the squad with strength that dead tissue should not possess. The sergeant ordered immediate withdrawal, but his squad found that the passages they had used to enter the vessel no longer led to the same locations. Corridors that had been straight now curved at impossible angles, and distances that should have required minutes to traverse seemed to stretch for hours. The squad eventually fought their way back to their boarding craft, but 3 battle brothers remained missing when they departed. Recovery efforts found no trace of the missing Marines, and the derelict vessel disappeared from auger scans as if it had never existed. The Death Specter's librarians reported increased difficulty maintaining psychic communication across the distances their operations required. The warp currents in the region had always been turbulent, but following the Great Rift's formation, they became actively hostile to psychic activity. Astropathic messages that previously arrived corrupted but decipherable now emerged as incomprehensible fragments that caused physical pain to the receiving psychers. Several astropaths died attempting to receive transmissions from deep within the Ghoul Stars, their minds burned out by contact with whatever now inhabited the warp currents. The chapter's chief librarian implemented new protocols that limited psychic communication to emergency situations, forcing greater reliance on physical courier vessels to maintain contact between dispersed forces. The librarians themselves faced threats during operations that tested their abilities beyond normal combat applications. Psychic entities that had previously remained dormant or hidden now manifested with increasing frequency, drawn to the presence of psychers like predators detecting wounded prey. These entities defied classification according to standard demonic taxonomies, their forms suggesting neither the ruinous power's servants nor the typical warp predators that librarians trained to combat. They appeared as absences rather than presences, voids in reality that consumed psychic energy and left emptiness in their wake. Librarians who attempted to engage these entities, with their powers reported feeling their connection to the warp being severed, their abilities simply ceasing to function until the entities withdrew or were driven off through conventional weapons fire. The strategic assessment provided by the Death Specter's command structure painted a picture of a region approaching critical instability. The chapter master's reports to higher Imperial authority described threat levels that exceeded anything encountered during the previous 10,000 years of the chapter's vigil. The increase in Xenos activity, the appearance of new threat types, and the fundamental changes in the region's warp environment all suggested that something significant was occurring within the Ghoul Stars' depths. The chapter's intelligence indicated that the various threats operating in the region showed signs of coordination that went beyond the opportunistic cooperation occasionally observed in previous centuries. Multiple sources reported sightings of massive structures under construction in deep space within the Ghoul Stars' interior systems. Long-range auger scans detected energy signatures consistent with industrial activity on scales that rivaled Forge World output, yet the locations showed no signs of Imperial or recognized Xenos presence. The Death Specters attempted to investigate these construction sites, but each expedition encountered defensive measures that forced them to withdraw before gathering conclusive intelligence. The defenses included automated weapons platforms that deployed in numbers suggesting massive manufacturing capacity, along with what appeared to be coordinated attacks by multiple hostile factions that shouldn't have been capable of working together. The implications troubled Imperial strategists who reviewed the Death Specter's reports. If something within the Ghoul Stars was indeed coordinating the region's various threats and constructing installations of such scale, it represented a danger that exceeded the capacity of a single Space Marine chapter to contain. Proposals circulated through Imperial command structures, suggesting the need for a major military commitment to the region, a Crusade-scale operation that would push deep into the Ghoul Stars and eliminate whatever threat was organizing resistance to Imperial authority. The Death Specter's leadership opposed these proposals with the same arguments they had used against increased commercial traffic, emphasizing that large-scale military operations in the region's hostile environment would result in catastrophic losses for minimal strategic gain. The debate over appropriate response to the Ghoul Stars' increased threat level remained unresolved as Imperial authorities struggled with more immediate crises across the galaxy. The Great Rift's formation had created emergencies in every segmentum, with demon incursions and Xenos invasions demanding resources that might otherwise have been committed to addressing the Ghoul Stars situation. The Death Specters found themselves fighting an increasingly desperate defensive campaign, with resources stretched beyond sustainable limits, their requests for additional support competing against countless other demands on Imperial military capacity. The chapter maintained its vigil through determination and the knowledge that failure would open a route for horrors from the Ghoul Stars to pour into Imperial space, but the strain showed in casualty reports that documented losses the chapter could not easily replace. The Primaris reinforcements provided some relief, their enhanced capabilities allowing them to take on roles that would have required multiple traditional Marines. As the new Battle Brothers gained experience operating in the Ghoul Stars, their effectiveness improved significantly. Squads that had suffered heavy casualties in their initial engagements began achieving success rates comparable to veteran forces, their enhanced physiology combining with hard-won tactical knowledge to create warriors ideally suited for the region's unique challenges. The chapter's apothecaries reported that Primaris Marines showed greater resistance to the psychological effects of extended operations in the Ghoul Stars, their enhanced neurological systems providing some protection against the mental strain that affected traditional Battle Brothers. However, the Primaris Marines also displayed concerning tendencies that the Death Specters' leadership monitored carefully. Some Battle Brothers reported experiencing visions during meditation periods, seeing images of vast structures in the darkness between stars and hearing voices that spoke in languages they didn't recognize, but somehow understood. These experiences resembled the symptoms that had historically indicated warp corruption, yet the affected Marines showed no signs of actual taint when examined by the chapter's librarians. The visions appeared to convey information rather than temptation, showing locations within the Ghoul Stars and warning of threats that subsequently manifested exactly as the visions had depicted. The chapter's command structure debated whether these visions represented genuine precognitive ability enhanced by the Primaris modifications or something more sinister attempting to manipulate the chapter's operations. The current situation in the Ghoul Stars, as the 42nd millennium progressed, represented a threat that demanded constant vigilance and consumed resources the Imperium could barely spare. The region that had always served as a source of horror stories and cautionary tales had evolved into an active danger that required permanent military commitment to contain. The Death Specters continued their eternal watch, their vessels patrolling routes through darkness that seemed to grow deeper with each passing year, facing enemies that grew more numerous and coordinated with each engagement. The chapter's Battle Brothers understood that they fought not for victory, but for containment, buying time for the Imperium to address threats that seemed more immediate while preventing the horrors of the Ghoul Stars from spreading beyond their current boundaries. The accumulated evidence from 10,000 years of Imperial observation has produced numerous theories attempting to explain the Ghoul Stars' true nature, though none have achieved consensus among those few scholars with access to the relevant data. The most prevalent hypothesis suggests the region served as a testing ground for weapons development during humanity's dark age of technology, with the stellar engineering projects and advanced facilities discovered throughout the area supporting this interpretation. The theory proposes that the ancient human civilization conducted experiments involving stellar manipulation and dimensional engineering that went catastrophically wrong, weakening the barrier between real space and the warp in ways that proved irreversible. The dying stars and spatial anomalies would represent the aftermath of these experiments, with the region's current state serving as a permanent reminder of humanity's hubris during its technological zenith. This weapons testing ground hypothesis gains support from the nature of installations discovered on worlds throughout the Ghoul Stars. Many facilities show design characteristics consistent with military research rather than civilian habitation, their structures built to contain dangerous materials, and their layouts suggesting protocols for managing catastrophic failures. The presence of stasis vaults containing devices that Imperial tech priests cannot safely activate indicates the ancient humans recognized the dangers their creations posed. However, this theory struggles to explain certain phenomena observed in the region, particularly the coordinated behavior of diverse Xeno species and the apparent intelligence directing threats against Imperial forces. Weapons testing grounds do not typically develop autonomous defensive capabilities that persist for thousands of years after their creator's extinction. An alternative theory proposes that the Ghoul Stars represent a deliberate trap constructed by one or more Xeno civilizations during the pre-Imperial era. This hypothesis suggests that ancient aliens recognized humanity's potential for galactic dominance and created a region designed to lure human explorers to their doom. The trap would function through multiple mechanisms working in concert: the promise of valuable Dark Age technology to attract expeditions, spatial anomalies and warp disturbances to disorient and separate forces, and resident Xenos populations to eliminate survivors. The theory accounts for the coordinated nature of threats in the region by proposing that the various hostile species serve as components of the trap's design rather than independent actors. The Scyther fiends and other organisms would represent biological weapons deployed by the trap's creators, programmed or evolved to attack human populations specifically. The Xenos trap theory explains several otherwise puzzling aspects of the Ghoul Stars' behavior. The precision with which threats emerge to counter Imperial expeditions suggests advanced knowledge of human capabilities and tactics that a deliberately designed system might possess. The way different hostile forces sometimes coordinate their attacks implies underlying control mechanisms rather than coincidental timing. The presence of automated defense systems that activate in response to Imperial presence indicates planning and preparation rather than natural development. However, this theory requires accepting that Xeno civilizations possessed capabilities far exceeding anything the Imperium has encountered among currently active alien species. The scale of engineering required to transform an entire region of space into a functional trap exceeds even the Necron's demonstrated abilities, suggesting either grossly incomplete Imperial understanding of ancient Xenos' capabilities or fundamental flaws in the theory's premises. The most disturbing hypothesis, whispered among Inquisitors who have devoted their careers to studying the Ghoul Stars, proposes that the region serves as a doorway to something worse than simple warp corruption or Xenos threats. This theory suggests that the Ghoul Stars occupy a location where the galaxy's structure thins, where the barriers separating real space from other dimensions, beyond even the warp, grow weak enough for entities from those outer darknesses to observe and potentially enter our universe. The dying stars would represent not natural stellar evolution, but active consumption by intelligences that feed on stellar matter and energy. The spatial anomalies would mark points where these entities have pushed through the dimensional barriers, creating wounds in reality that bleed exotic physics into normal space. This outer darkness hypothesis draws support from accounts provided by psychers who have operated in the region and survived with their sanity intact. Their descriptions consistently reference sensations of being watched by vast consciousnesses that exist beyond human comprehension, entities whose thoughts operate on scales measured in geological ages rather than human lifetimes. The visions reported by some Primaris Marines stationed with the Death Specters align with this theory, showing structures and spaces that appear to exist outside normal dimensional parameters. The theory also explains why the Ghoul Stars' threats demonstrate coordination without obvious communication methods, suggesting that the various hostile forces respond to direction from entities that exist beyond the reach of conventional detection. The potential connections between the Ghoul Stars and other dark regions of space have occupied Imperial astrocartographers and strategic analysts for millennia. The halo stars, positioned at the galaxy's extreme edge, where stellar density drops precipitously, share certain characteristics with the Ghoul Stars despite their physical separation by vast distances. Both regions feature dying stellar bodies, spatial anomalies that defy standard physics, and reports of entities that challenge Imperial understanding of biology and physics. Survey data from the limited expeditions that have reached the halo stars describe phenomena remarkably similar to those encountered in the Ghoul Stars. Reality tiers that bleed warp energy into normal space, automated defense systems of unknown origin, and Xenos species that demonstrate capabilities exceeding their apparent technological level. The similarities suggest either parallel development of similar conditions in both regions or some form of connection between them that Imperial science cannot detect through conventional means. Some theorists propose that both regions occupy points where the galaxy's structure creates natural weaknesses in dimensional barriers, making them susceptible to the same types of corruption and infiltration. Others suggest more direct connections, hypothesizing the existence of passages through dimensions beyond the warp that link the Ghoul Stars and Halo Stars despite their physical separation. The few navigator houses that maintain charts of both regions report unusual correspondences in their warp root structures, with certain currents in the Imperium appearing to flow between the areas in ways that suggest underlying connections. The Veiled region, located in the galaxy's southern reaches, presents another area of concern that may relate to the Ghoul Stars through mechanisms the Imperium has yet to understand. This zone of space remains largely unmapped in Imperial charts, its interior systems hidden behind dense nebulae that block conventional observation and create warp currents that make navigation extremely hazardous. The limited intelligence gathered from the Veiled region's borders describes conditions that mirror aspects of the Ghoul Stars. Hostile Xenos populations, evidence of ancient civilizations that achieved and then lost technological sophistication, and reports of phenomena that suggest dimensional instability. The Ordo Xenos maintains files documenting possible connections between Xenos species encountered in both regions, with genetic analysis suggesting that certain organisms found in the Ghoul Stars share biological markers with creatures observed near the Veiled region. The pattern emerging from analysis of these dark regions suggests that the galaxy contains multiple zones where similar conditions prevail, areas where the normal rules governing space and the warp break down in comparable ways. Whether these zones represent independent developments or parts of some larger structure remains unclear, but their existence raises troubling questions about the galaxy's fundamental nature. If multiple regions throughout the galaxy exhibit similar instabilities and host similar threats, it suggests that the Imperium faces not isolated problems, but symptoms of something affecting the entire galactic structure. The implications challenge assumptions about the permanence and stability of the material universe that Imperial doctrine takes as foundational truth. Speculation about what lies at the heart of the Ghoul Stars has produced theories ranging from mundane to apocalyptic. The most conservative proposals suggest that the region's center contains nothing more exotic than a dense cluster of dying stars whose combined gravitational and radiation effects create the observed phenomena. This interpretation treats the Ghoul Stars as a natural astronomical formation that happens to be particularly hostile to human exploration, with the various threats representing opportunistic exploitation of the difficult conditions rather than coordinated opposition. The theory's proponents point to the lack of conclusive evidence for any central intelligence or structure directing the region's behavior, arguing that pattern-seeking human minds impose order on what are essentially random events. More ambitious theories propose that the Ghoul Star's heart contains a relic from the war in heaven, the ancient conflict between the Old Ones and the Necrons that shaped the galaxy's current state. This hypothesis suggests that the combatants deployed weapons or created structures in the region that continue affecting local space millions of years after the war's conclusion. The reality tiers and spatial anomalies would represent damage from weapons that operated on principles beyond conventional physics, while the hostile automated systems could be ancient war machines still executing their original programming. The presence of multiple Xeno species adapted to the region's conditions might indicate deliberate biological engineering by the Old Ones, who created numerous servitor races during their war against the Necrons. The most extreme theories propose that something actively malevolent occupies the Ghoul Stars core, an intelligence or entity that has claimed the region as its territory and works to expand its influence outward. This entity might be a warp presence of sufficient power to affect real space directly, a Xenos intelligence that has achieved technological or psychic capabilities beyond anything the Imperium has encountered, or something from dimensions beyond even the warp that has found a way to manifest in our universe. The theory accounts for the coordinated nature of threats emerging from the region by proposing that this central intelligence directs or influences the various hostile forces, using them as tools to achieve objectives that remain opaque to Imperial observers. The Imperium's quarantine protocols for the Ghoul Stars reflect the uncertainty surrounding the region's true nature and the recognition that current Imperial capabilities cannot eliminate whatever threats lurk in its depths. The restrictions on travel and settlement stem from hard experience with expeditions that ventured too deep and either vanished completely or returned with survivors whose accounts suggested exposure to corrupting influences. The Imperial Navy maintains its patrol routes along the region's borders, not because these patrols can prevent determined incursions, but because they provide early warning of threats emerging from the interior. The Death Spectre's permanent assignment to watch over the region represents the Imperium's acknowledgement that active military presence is required to contain rather than eliminate the danger. The quarantine's effectiveness depends on maintaining strict control over who enters the region and ensuring that anything emerging from it faces immediate military response. The Administratum's records contain lists of authorized personnel and vessels permitted to operate in the Ghoul Stars, with violations of these restrictions treated as serious offenses warranting severe punishment. Rogue traders who possess the ancient charts and specialized equipment necessary for navigation through the region's hazards must submit detailed flight plans and maintain regular contact with Imperial authorities. Ships that fail to report on scheduled trigger alert protocols that dispatch Death Spectre's patrols to investigate, with standing orders to destroy any vessel showing signs of corruption or Xenos infiltration, rather than risk contamination spreading to Imperial space. The quarantine protocols extend beyond simple travel restrictions to encompass information control measures designed to limit knowledge about the Ghoul Stars' true conditions. The Inquisition maintains strict oversight of reports and data gathered from the region, classifying most information at levels that restrict access to personnel with demonstrated need to know. This information control serves multiple purposes, preventing panic among Imperial populations who might learn about threats their government cannot eliminate, limiting knowledge that enemies of the Imperium might exploit, and containing potentially corrupting information that could serve as vectors for mimetic or psychic contamination. The Death Specters cooperate with these information control measures, maintaining their own archives separately from general Imperial records and sharing intelligence only with specifically authorized recipients. The existential question facing Imperial strategic planners concerns whether containment represents a sufficient long-term solution or merely delays an inevitable catastrophe. The evidence accumulated over 10 millennia demonstrates that the Ghoul Stars pose persistent threats that show no signs of diminishing through simple isolation. The increased activity following the Great Rift's formation suggests that the region responds to galactic-scale events, potentially growing more dangerous as the Imperium faces other crises. The coordination observed among different threat types implies that something within the region possesses strategic intelligence and works toward objectives that may include expansion beyond current boundaries. The Death Spectre's reports document a steady increase in the frequency and scale of incursions from the Ghoul Stars over recent centuries, with each decade seeing more attacks than the last. The Xenos raiders demonstrate improving capabilities that suggest either technological advancement or access to resources that allow them to build more sophisticated weapons and vessels. The appearance of new threat types that Imperial forces had never previously encountered indicates that the region continues generating or attracting hostile forces rather than simply harboring a static population of enemies. The construction activity detected in the interior systems points to preparation for operations on scales that current containment measures may prove inadequate to counter. Some Imperial strategists argue that the Imperium must eventually commit to a major offensive into the Ghoul Stars, accepting the casualties and resource expenditure required to eliminate threats at their source rather than simply responding to raids and incursions. This position emphasizes that containment only works as long as the Imperium maintains sufficient military strength along the region's borders, and that any significant weakening of these defenses could allow catastrophic breaches. The proponents of offensive action point to historical precedents where the Imperium's enemies grew stronger during periods when Imperial forces remained on the defensive, eventually requiring far greater efforts to defeat than would have been necessary if addressed earlier. The opposing viewpoint, strongly advocated by the Death Specters and supported by most Inquisitors familiar with the region, maintains that offensive operations into the Ghoul Stars would consume enormous resources for uncertain gain, while potentially triggering responses that make the situation worse rather than better. The failed expeditions of the past demonstrate that the region's hostile environment and coordinated defenses can destroy even substantial military forces. The unknown nature of what lies at the Ghoul Stars' heart means that an offensive might encounter threats that Imperial forces are fundamentally unprepared to combat. The risk of corruption affecting large numbers of Imperial personnel during extended operations in such a warp-saturated environment could create new problems even if the offensive achieved its tactical objectives. The debate remains unresolved as the Imperium struggles with the reality that the Ghoul Stars represent a problem without clear solutions. The region cannot be ignored because the threats it harbors periodically emerge to attack Imperial territory, killing thousands and destroying valuable infrastructure. It cannot be easily eliminated because every attempt to do so has failed, often catastrophically. It cannot be safely studied because the act of investigation risks corruption and provides the region's hostile forces with opportunities to strike at Imperial expeditions. The Imperium finds itself locked into a strategy of containment by default, maintaining the quarantine and responding to incursions, while hoping that future developments might provide better options. The Death Specters continue their eternal vigil, understanding that their role requires accepting a mission without victory conditions or end dates. The chapter's Battle Brothers patrol routes through darkness that grows deeper each year, facing enemies that become more numerous with each passing decade, fighting battles that achieve nothing more than preventing disaster for another day. They know that the Ghoul Stars will likely outlast them, that the region's threats will continue long after the chapter's last battle brother falls. Yet they maintain their watch because someone must, because the alternative is allowing the horrors lurking in that cursed space to spread unchecked into the wider Imperium. The question of whether the Ghoul Stars represent a growing threat that will eventually consume surrounding sectors, or a contained problem that can be managed indefinitely through current protocols, may ultimately prove irrelevant. The region exists as a wound in the galaxy's flesh, a zone where reality itself has been compromised in ways that 10,000 years of Imperial observation have failed to fully understand. Whether it serves as an ancient weapon testing ground, a Xenos trap, or a doorway to something worse matters less than the practical reality that it harbors threats the Imperium cannot eliminate and must therefore contain. The darkness between those dying stars watches the Imperium with patient malevolence, and the Imperium stares back through the eyes of the Death Specters, both sides locked in a confrontation that may last until the galaxy's final days.